Welcome. Tonight on NightSleepWhisper, we are embarking on a journey beyond time and space. Leave the noise of the outside world behind. Right now, there is only you, me, and the rhythm of the ocean. Tonight, together with Thomas Wicks, we will uncover the massive 50-chapter mystery of Stormy Lighthouse. Between the crashing waves, the creaking stairs, and the ancient secrets, I will be here until you drift away. If you are ready, adjust your pillow, close your eyes gently, and focus only on my voice. Our journey begins now. Thomas stood on the small wooden boat. The sea was dark blue, and the water moved up and down with the wind. He held his old leather bag very tightly. Inside the bag were his clothes, a few books, and a picture of his old ship. Thomas was a retired sailor who spent 40 years on the ocean. Now, he wanted a quiet life away from the busy world. The boat stopped at a small stone dock. A man with a grey hat helped Thomas carry his bag. This was Mr. Henderson, the mayor of the small town near the coast. He was a serious man with a deep voice. "It is a very lonely place, Thomas," Mr. Henderson said. He pointed to the top of the cliff. "Are you sure you want to live here?" "I like the silence," Thomas replied. He looked up at his new home. The Stormy Lighthouse was very tall and strong. It was painted white, but the paint was old and peeling. At the top, a large glass lamp sat under a black metal roof. The wind moved through the tall grass around the tower. The air made a low whistling noise as it passed the stone walls. They walked up a narrow, steep path. The rocks were sharp and wet from the sea spray. Thomas could smell the fresh salt in the air. The sun was going down behind the hills. The sky was a mix of orange and dark purple. "Here is the key," Mr. Henderson said. He reached into his pocket and gave Thomas a heavy iron key. "The previous keeper, Mr. Gable, left a month ago. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He just went away one night." "Why did he leave so suddenly?" Thomas asked. He looked at the heavy wooden door of the lighthouse. "Nobody knows," the mayor said. He looked out at the dark water. "People in town say the lighthouse has secrets. They say it is an unhappy place. But you are a sailor. You are a brave and practical man." Mr. Henderson walked back to his boat. Thomas stood alone in front of the door. He put the heavy key into the lock. It was rusty and hard to turn. He used both hands and pushed the door open. The air inside the lighthouse was cold and smelled like old dust. Thomas walked into the small kitchen on the first floor. There was a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. A tiny window looked out at the ocean. Outside, the waves hit the rocks below with a powerful force. The sound of the moving water filled the small room. He put his bag on the table. He was very tired from the long trip. He looked at the stone stairs. They went up the wall in a large circle. They led to the living room, the bedroom, and finally the light at the top. Thomas knew his job was important. He had to keep the light burning for the ships at sea. He sat down in one of the wooden chairs. He felt a small piece of paper on the seat. He picked it up. It was a short note written in messy ink. It said, "Do not stay here after dark." Thomas looked at the note for a long time. He did not believe in ghost stories. He was a man of facts. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He decided to make some tea to warm his hands. However, he felt a strange sensation. He felt as if someone was watching him. He turned and looked at the window. There was only the dark sea and the light of the rising moon. Thomas finished his cup of tea. The kitchen was very quiet now. He stood up and picked up his oil lamp. The yellow flame moved as he walked. He wanted to see the rest of his new home. He went to the stone stairs and started to climb. He reached the second floor. This was the bedroom. It was a small, round room with a wooden bed and a large wardrobe. Thomas opened the wardrobe doors. He expected to see empty shelves. Instead, he saw many clothes. There were thick wool coats, blue shirts, and heavy trousers. They were not his clothes. They belonged to Mr. Gable, the man who lived here before him. This is very strange, Thomas said to himself. He looked at the floor near the bed. A pair of expensive leather boots stood there. They looked almost new. Thomas knew that good boots were important for a man on a rocky island. Nobody would leave them behind. He walked to a small table next to the bed. He saw a brown leather wallet. Thomas picked it up and opened it. Inside, there was a large amount of money. There were also some old photographs. One photo showed a tall man with a big beard and a kind smile. Thomas was sure this was Mr. Gable. Thomas felt a cold shiver on his back. A man does not leave his money, his clothes, and his best boots if he wants to start a new life. If Mr. Gable moved away, he would take these things with him. It looked like the man disappeared in the middle of the night. Thomas left the bedroom and climbed higher. The third floor was a small living room. There were many books on the shelves. However, some books were now on the floor. A wooden chair was turned over. It looked like someone was in a great hurry. Perhaps there was a struggle in this room. The wind hit the thick stone walls of the lighthouse with a heavy force. The sound of the ocean was constant and deep. It felt like the water was trying to tell him a secret. Thomas looked out of the small living room window. The moon was bright now. He could see the white foam of the waves hitting the sharp rocks below. He thought about the note in his pocket. Do not stay here after dark. The sun was gone, and the darkness was everywhere. Thomas was a brave man, but he felt very small inside the giant stone tower. He went back down to the kitchen and checked the heavy wooden door. He pushed the iron bolt into place. He sat at the table and looked at the shadows on the wall. He was the new keeper of the Stormy Point Lighthouse, but he was not alone. The memory of Mr. Gable was everywhere in the house. Thomas decided he needed to find out the truth. He needed to know what happened to the man who left his life behind in a single night. Thomas could not sleep well that night. The bed was hard, and the air in the bedroom was too cold. He got up very early the next morning. The sun was rising over the sea. It was a beautiful day, but Thomas had many questions in his mind. He went down to the kitchen to start his daily work. The kitchen was very dirty. There was thick dust on the shelves and old grease on the walls. Thomas was a sailor, and he liked things to be clean and organized. He found an old cloth and a bucket of water. He began to scrub the wooden table. Then, he moved to the stone wall near the small stove. As he cleaned the wall, he noticed something strange. The stones were very old and grey. However, one brick near the floor looked different. It was a little bit loose. Thomas touched the brick with his finger. It moved back and forth. That is not right, Thomas said softly to himself. He used a small knife from the table to pull at the edge of the brick. The brick was heavy and rough. It came out of the wall. Behind the brick, there was a small, dark hole. It was a secret hiding place. Thomas reached into the hole. His hand touched something soft and cold. He pulled it out slowly. It was a small diary with a black leather cover. It was covered in grey dust and thin spider webs. Thomas sat down at the wooden table and blew the dust away. He wiped the cover with his clean cloth until it looked new again. The book was old, but the paper inside was still white. Thomas opened the first page. He saw the name Arthur Gable written in careful, tall letters. This was the personal diary of the man who disappeared. Thomas started to read the first few pages. At first, the diary was very normal. Mr. Gable wrote about the weather. He wrote about the ships he saw in the distance. He wrote about the soup he cooked on the small stove. He seemed like a quiet, happy man who loved his job. But as Thomas turned the pages, the writing changed. The letters became messy and very small. Mr. Gable began to write about them. He did not say who they were. He wrote about strange lights in the sea caves. He wrote about people walking on the beach at midnight. Thomas felt a heavy weight in his chest. He looked at the empty space in the wall. Why did Mr. Gable hide this book? He was clearly afraid of something. He wanted to keep his thoughts a secret from the people in the town. Thomas heard a low sound from the door. It was the wind pushing against the heavy wood. It sounded like a person trying to get inside. Thomas quickly put the diary in his deep pocket. He did not want anyone to see it. He put the brick back into the hole and pushed it until it was tight. The kitchen looked clean now. But Thomas did not feel happy. He knew that the lighthouse was not just a lonely place. It was a place with a dangerous story. He decided to take the diary to the top of the tower. He wanted to read more in the bright light of the day. Thomas climbed the long, winding stairs to the very top of the lighthouse. His legs felt heavy, but he did not stop. He reached the lantern room. This was a large circle of thick glass windows. In the center stood the great lamp. It was a beautiful piece of machinery with many glass lenses. During the day, the sun made the glass sparkle like many diamonds. Thomas sat on a small metal stool near the window. He took the black diary out of his pocket. The air at the top of the tower was warmer because of the sun. He turned the pages of the diary past the notes about soup and weather. He reached the middle of the book. The writing here was very different. The ink was dark and thick. It looked like Mr. Gable pressed the pen very hard into the paper. On one page, there was only one sentence. It was written in large, capital letters. Do not trust the lights from the sea. Thomas looked out at the ocean. The water was blue and calm today. He saw a few white birds flying near the surface. He thought about the sentence. What did it mean? Usually, lights from the sea were a good thing. They meant a ship was passing by. They meant other people were near. Why did Mr. Gable fear them? He read the next page. They come when the moon is thin. The diary said, they do not use the main channel. They move in the shadows of the tall cliffs. Last night, I saw a green light near the old caves. It was a signal. Someone on the land answered with a white light. I think they are watching the lighthouse. I think they are watching me. Thomas felt a cold knot in his stomach. He was a man who lived a simple life. He did not like trouble. But now, he was in the middle of a mystery. He looked down at the base of the cliff. The rocks were sharp and dangerous. Below the lighthouse, there were many dark openings in the stone. These were the sea caves. At high tide, the water filled them completely. As he watched the shore, he saw something move. It was not a bird or a piece of wood. It was a person. A woman was walking slowly across the wet rocks. She wore a long, dark coat. Her hair moved wildly in the wind. She stopped near a large pool of water and looked down. She seemed to be searching for something in the sand between the stones. She looked up at the lighthouse for a brief second. Thomas moved back into the shadows. He did not want her to see him. Who is she? Thomas whispered. The woman stayed on the shore for a few minutes. Then, she turned and walked toward the path that led to the town. Thomas watched her until she disappeared behind a hill. He looked back at the diary. The warning in the ink seemed more important now. The previous keeper was gone, and now there were strange people near the rocks. Thomas stood up. He had to prepare the lamp for the night. He had to make sure the light was bright and steady. But in his mind, he was already thinking about the woman and the secret lights. He decided he would go down to the shore tomorrow. He wanted to see what she was looking for. The sun went down, and the world became very dark. Thomas worked hard to light the great lamp at the top of the tower. He turned a heavy metal handle, and the large glass lenses began to rotate slowly. A long, bright beam of white light cut through the darkness. It moved across the black water of the ocean like a giant finger. Thomas stood on the outside balcony of the lighthouse. The wind was very cold now. It pulled at his thick wool jacket. He looked down at the shore. The tide was going out, and more of the wet rocks were visible in the moonlight. Suddenly, he saw a small, moving light on the beach. It was not the big light of the lighthouse. It was a tiny, yellow light from a handheld flashlight. Someone was down there. Thomas watched closely. It was the same woman from the afternoon. The woman moved slowly between the large, sharp stones. She held her light close to the ground. Sometimes, she stopped and bent down. She used a small tool to move the sand and the seaweed. She looked very busy. She did not look like a tourist or a person taking a walk. She was searching for something specific. It is nearly midnight. Thomas thought. The rocks are slippery and dangerous. Why is she out there now? He went back inside and found an old pair of binoculars on a shelf. He put them to his eyes and looked again. Through the glass, he could see her face more clearly. She was an adult, perhaps 30 or 40 years old. Her face looked tired and very serious. She wore a dark green coat that was wet at the bottom. The woman stopped near a deep pool of water between two large rocks. She knelt down and reached into the water. She pulled out a piece of dark metal or wood. She looked at it for a few seconds. Then she threw it back into the sea. She looked disappointed. She wiped her hands on her coat and moved to the next pool. The sound of the ocean was very loud. The waves made a heavy, rhythmic noise as they hit the base of the cliff. The woman did not seem to hear the water. She was only interested in the ground. Thomas felt a strong desire to go down and talk to her. He wanted to ask her name and why she was there. But then he remembered the diary. He remembered the warning about the lights from the sea. Was this woman one of the people Mr. Gable feared? Suddenly, the woman stopped moving. She turned her head and looked up at the balcony of the lighthouse. Thomas did not move. He stayed in the shadows. The woman stood still for a long time. Then, she turned off her flashlight. The shore became completely dark. Thomas waited for 10 minutes, but he did not see her light again. She was gone, moving like a ghost through the shadows of the rocks. Thomas went back inside the tower and locked the balcony door. He felt cold, but not just from the wind. He knew his life at Stormy Point was not going to be quiet at all. The next morning, the sky was grey and heavy with clouds. Thomas woke up early. He did not feel rested. His mind was full of questions about the woman on the shore and the strange notes in the diary. He decided it was time to speak to someone in the town. He wanted to ask Mr. Henderson more questions about the history of the lighthouse. Thomas went to the small room behind the kitchen. This was the communications room. It was a tiny space with a wooden desk and a large, old-fashioned radio. The radio was a heavy black box with many metal buttons and a long wire that went out through the wall to an antenna on the roof. This was his only way to talk to the mainland. He sat in the wooden chair and turned the power dial. He expected to see a small green light on the front of the machine. He also expected to hear the low hum of electricity. But nothing happened. The radio remained dark and silent. That is strange. Thomas whispered. He checked the power cord. It was plugged into the wall. He turned the dial again, rotating it all the way to the right. Still, there was no sound. The radio was completely dead. Thomas felt a small spark of worry in his chest. A lighthouse keeper must always have a working radio. It was his lifeline in case of an emergency or a storm. Thomas pulled the heavy desk away from the wall. He wanted to look at the back of the machine. He held his flashlight in one hand and looked at the wires. His eyes widened in surprise. The main wire was not broken by accident. It was cut. The ends of the wire were sharp and clean. Someone used a pair of metal pliers or a sharp knife to slice through the thick plastic and copper. This was not a mistake. Someone did this on purpose. Thomas stood up slowly. He looked around the small room. The window was locked from the inside. The door to the kitchen was also closed. When did this happen? Did someone enter the lighthouse while he was sleeping? Or was the radio already broken when he arrived? He remembered the heavy iron key Mr. Henderson gave him. He remembered locking the front door last night. He walked back to the kitchen and checked the door. It was still locked. The iron bolt was in its place. He checked the small windows on the first floor. They were all closed and tight. Thomas felt a cold sweat on his forehead. If the doors were locked, how did someone get inside to cut the wires? Or perhaps, was there another way into the lighthouse that he did not know about? He was now completely alone. The nearest house was miles away across the water. Without the radio, he could not call for help. He could not tell the mayor about the woman or the diary. He was a prisoner on a rock in the middle of the sea. He went to the window and looked out. The waves were getting larger. The wind was starting to blow harder. A storm was coming. Thomas knew he had to fix the radio, but he did not have the tools or the extra wire. He realized he was now part of the secret of Stormy Point, whether he liked it or not. Thomas decided to search every corner of the lighthouse. He was very worried about the cut radio wires. He needed to know if anyone else was in the building. He started from the kitchen and worked his way up. He checked the storage rooms and the closets. He found nothing unusual until he reached the very top. Just below the large lantern room, there was a small landing there. In the corner, there was a narrow wooden door. It was painted a dark, heavy green. This door was different from the others. It was not made of simple wood. It had thick metal bands across it for extra strength. Thomas did not remember seeing this door when he first arrived at the lighthouse. He took the heavy ring of keys from his pocket. He looked at each key carefully. Some were small and made of brass. Others were large and made of iron. He tried the first key. It was too big for the lock. He tried the second key. It went into the hole, but it would not turn. He tried the third, the fourth, and the fifth. None of the keys on the ring worked. "This is the only door I cannot open," Thomas said. His voice sounded small in the large stone tower. He leaned his head against the cold wood and listened. For a long time, there was only the sound of the wind outside. Then, he heard something else. It was the sound of a heavy object moving across a floor. It was a slow, scraping sound. Thomas froze. If the door was locked and he had the keys to the lighthouse, who was moving things inside this room? He looked at the floor in front of the door. He saw a small, thin line of white powder. He touched it with his finger and tasted it. It was salt. Why was there salt on the floor here? The sea was far below. Salt did not usually travel this high unless someone brought it up the stairs. Thomas looked at the metal lock again. He saw fresh scratches on the surface. Someone recently tried to open this door with a tool. They were not successful. Or perhaps they were already inside. Thomas felt a cold wind coming from a small gap under the door. He shivered. He was the keeper of the lighthouse, but there was a part of his home that was a total secret. He thought about using his shoulder to break the door, but the wood was too strong. He needed a heavy tool, like a hammer or a crowbar. He decided to go back down to the tool shed outside. He felt more comfortable in the open air than near that mysterious green door. As he walked down the spiral stairs, he kept looking back. He felt like the door was a giant eye watching his every move. He realized that the lighthouse was not just a building. It was a puzzle, and he was missing many pieces. Thomas left the lighthouse and walked across the wet grass to the tool shed. The shed was a small, grey building made of wood. The wind moved the door back and forth. It made a rhythmic, wooden sound against the frame. Inside, the air was dry and smelled like old metal and oil. Thomas looked for a crowbar, but he stopped when he saw a shadow near the path. The woman from the shore was standing 10 meters away. She did not have her flashlight now. She wore the same dark green coat. Her face looked pale in the grey morning light. Thomas walked toward her slowly. He kept his hands in his pockets. "Good morning," Thomas said. His voice was steady. "Can I help you?" The woman looked at him for a long time. She looked tired. "My name is Elena," she said. Her voice was soft but clear. "I saw you on the balcony last night. I'm sorry if I scared you. I am not a thief." "Why were you on the rocks at midnight?" Thomas asked. "It is a dangerous place for a walk." Elena looked out at the ocean. The waves were high and white. "A year ago, my brother, Peter, disappeared," she said. "He was a fisherman. He was 40 years old and very experienced. One night, his boat was found empty near the sea caves below this lighthouse. The police said it was an accident. They said the sea took him." Thomas watched her carefully. "And you do not believe them?" "No," Elena replied. She shook her head. "Peter knew these waters better than anyone. He was a smart man. Before he disappeared, he told me he found something strange near Stormy Point. He said the lighthouse keeper, Mr. Gable, was acting very nervous. Peter thought there was something hidden in the caves." Thomas thought about the black diary in his pocket. He thought about the warning. "Do not trust the lights from the sea. I come here to look for his things." Elena continued. "Sometimes the sea brings objects to the shore. Last night, I found a piece of his boat, but it was broken into many tiny pieces. I think someone destroyed it on purpose." Thomas felt a connection to this woman. They were both looking for answers. "Mr. Gable is gone too," Thomas said. "He left all his clothes and his money. I found a diary. He was afraid of people watching the lighthouse." Elena moved closer. Her eyes were wide. "You found a diary. Does it mention the green lights?" "My brother saw green lights coming from the water. He said they were signals." "It mentions many things," Thomas said. He was not sure if he should trust her yet. "But the radio in the lighthouse is broken. The wires were cut. I am alone here, and I cannot call for help." Elena looked at the lighthouse with fear. "If the wires were cut, then someone is still here. Thomas, someone does not want you to talk to the town." A loud, heavy sound came from the top of the lighthouse. It was the sound of a heavy door closing with great force. Thomas and Elena both looked up at the tower. The green door was at the top, and Thomas knew he was not the only person with a key. Elena looked at Thomas with wide eyes. "I must go back to the village," she said quickly. "It is not safe for me to be here after the sun goes down. But please, Thomas, be very careful." She turned and walked away fast. Her dark coat moved in the wind as she disappeared into the grey mist. Thomas stood alone near the tool shed. He looked up at the lighthouse. The tall white tower looked like a giant ghost against the dark clouds. He went back inside and locked the heavy front door. He used the iron bolt and a second wooden bar. He wanted to feel safe, but the memory of the loud noise from the tower remained in his mind. Night arrived quickly. The moon was hidden behind the thick clouds. Thomas did not go to the top of the tower immediately. He stayed in the living room on the 3rd floor. He turned off his oil lamp so the room was completely dark. He sat in a wooden chair near the window and looked out at the ocean. The sea was very angry. The water was black, and the waves were high. For a long time, there was nothing to see. Then, a tiny point of light appeared on the horizon. It was not a white light from a normal ship. It was a bright, neon green light. The light flashed 3 times. It stopped for a few seconds. Then it flashed 3 times again. Thomas picked up his binoculars. He held them to his eyes and moved the dial until the image was sharp. He saw a boat. It was not a small fishing boat like the ones in the village. It was a long, black boat with no name on the side. It sat low in the water, which meant it was carrying something very heavy. That is the signal Mr. Gable wrote about. Thomas whispered to himself. Suddenly, a response came from the shore below the lighthouse. A white light flashed from the direction of the sea caves. It moved in a circle. Then it went out. The green light on the boat flashed once more and then disappeared. The black boat started to move toward the cliffs. It moved very fast and did not make a typical engine noise. Thomas felt his heart beating fast. This was a secret meeting. The people on the boat were communicating with someone on the island. Was it Victor, the man with the scar from his thoughts? Or was it someone else? He remembered the salt on the floor near the green door. He realized that the person on the land might be inside the lighthouse with him right now. He looked at the ceiling. The green door was just above him. He did not have a gun or a weapon. He only had his flashlight and his old sailor's knife. He stood up slowly. He decided he could not wait for the morning. He had to know who was sending the signals. He had to know if the boat was coming for the treasure mentioned in the diary. The wind hit the glass window with a heavy force. Thomas took a deep breath. He picked up his heavy flashlight and walked toward the stairs. Every step he took on the stone made a soft, echoing noise. He started to climb, heading toward the dark balcony. Thomas stopped on the stairs. He paused and listened carefully. He realized something important. The white light signal he saw earlier did not come from the top of the tower. It came from somewhere much lower, near the base of the cliff. If he stayed at the top of the lighthouse, he would be far away from the action. He turned around and walked back down the spiral stone steps. He moved quietly, trying not to make his boots strike the stone too hard. He reached the first floor and entered the kitchen. The room was dark and filled with long shadows. He used his flashlight to look at the ground. He noticed something he did not see before. The heavy blue rug under the kitchen table was not straight. One corner was folded over, and there were small bits of dried mud on the wood. Thomas pushed the heavy wooden table to the side. It was a difficult task, and he breathed heavily as he worked. Then, he pulled the rug away from the center of the room. Under the rug, the floor was made of thick wooden planks. In the middle of the planks, there was a square shape. It was a trapdoor. He knelt on the floor and searched for a handle. He saw a small iron ring hidden in a hole in the wood. He grabbed the ring and pulled. The trapdoor was very heavy. He used all the strength in his arms and back. The wood made a long, scraping noise against the stone floor. Finally, the door opened. A smell of salt, old fish, and wet earth came from the hole. It was a strong, unpleasant smell. Thomas held his flashlight over the opening. He saw a set of narrow stone stairs. These stairs did not go up into the tower. They went down, deep into the cold ground. This is not on the maps of the lighthouse. Thomas whispered to himself. He looked at the stairs. They were wet and covered in a thin layer of green moss. He saw fresh footprints in the mud on the first few steps. The footprints were large and wide. They did not belong to Elena, and they certainly were not his own. Someone had gone down there very recently. Thomas knew this was dangerous. He was one man alone on a dark night, and he was following a stranger into a hole in the ground. But he could not stop now. He had to know where these stairs led. He thought about the green lights and the black boat waiting in the ocean. He stepped onto the first stone stair. The air was very thin and much colder than the kitchen. He reached up and closed the trapdoor above him. He did not want a visitor to see the open door. Now, he was in total darkness, except for the small, bright beam of his flashlight. The walls were made of rough, natural rock. Water dripped slowly from the ceiling. Every few seconds, a drop of water hit the floor with a soft, wet sound. The stairs were slippery, so Thomas held onto the cold rock wall with his left hand. He felt the dampness on his skin. He counted the steps as he went down. 10, 20, 30. He was now far below the lighthouse. He realized he was likely inside the cliff itself. The sound of the ocean changed. It was no longer a splash. It was a deep, low thumping sound that moved the air. At the bottom of the stairs, he reached a small, square room. It was a storage area carved directly into the stone. There were several wooden crates against the wall. Some were open. Inside, he saw straw and pieces of white packing paper. Thomas moved his light to the back of the room and saw a heavy metal door. It was slightly open. A cold wind blew through the gap, bringing the sound of the crashing waves even closer. Thomas pushed the heavy metal door. It was very cold to the touch. The door moved slowly on its hinges. It made a long, high sound that echoed through the small room. Behind the door, there was no more stone floor. Instead, there was a narrow tunnel made of dark earth and old wooden beams. The air here was even wetter than before. Thomas could feel the moisture on his face. He stepped into the tunnel. The ground was soft and muddy. He kept his flashlight beam low so he could see where to walk. The wooden beams above his head looked very old. Some of them were cracked. Thomas worried that the tunnel might fall, but he had to keep moving. He was a sailor, and he was used to tight, dangerous spaces on ships. The tunnel was not straight. It turned to the left and then to the right. Thomas realized he was walking toward the ocean. The deep, rhythmic thumping of the waves grew louder with every step. The sound moved through the earth and into the soles of his boots. It felt like the heartbeat of the island. He walked for several minutes. The tunnel was very quiet. The only sound was the wet squelch of his boots in the mud. Suddenly, his light hit something bright on the ground. He stopped and bent down. It was a small, plastic wrapper from a candy bar. Thomas picked it up. The wrapper was clean and dry. It was not old. This meant that someone sat here recently. Maybe they were waiting for the signal from the green light. Thomas felt a cold chill. The person who dropped this was likely very close. He moved more slowly now. He turned off his flashlight for a moment to see if there was any light ahead. At first, everything was completely black. He could not even see his own hands. Then, far in the distance, he saw a tiny, faint glow. It was not a steady light. It moved back and forth. Thomas turned his flashlight back on, but he covered the lens with his hand. Only a small amount of light came through his fingers. He continued walking. The tunnel started to go down again. The walls changed from earth to hard, black rock. The smell of salt was very strong now. He was near the sea caves. He saw another object on a small ledge in the rock wall. It was an old oil lantern, but it was not lit. Next to the lantern, there was a box of matches and a pair of heavy work gloves. Thomas touched the gloves. They were damp, but they were not covered in dust. Someone uses this tunnel every day, Thomas thought. The tunnel opened into a larger space. Thomas stood at the edge of a great cavern. He looked down and saw the dark water of the ocean flowing into the cave. The tide was coming in. The water was white and angry as it hit the cave walls. He realized that this tunnel was a secret path. It connected the lighthouse directly to the sea. He heard a voice. It was a man's voice, deep and rough. The voice came from the other side of the cavern. Thomas quickly turned off his light and pressed his back against the cold rock. He held his breath and waited in the perfect darkness. Thomas pressed his body against the wet rock wall. He did not move a single muscle. His heart was beating very fast, but he tried to breathe slowly and quietly. In the darkness of the large cave, two men were talking. Their voices echoed against the high stone ceiling. "The boat is late," the first man said. His voice was deep and sounded very tired. "The storm is making the water dangerous," the second man replied. Thomas recognized this voice. It was the man with the grey hat. Mr. Henderson, the mayor. Thomas was shocked. The mayor was part of this secret. The two men walked toward the edge of the water. Their heavy boots made a slow, rhythmic noise on the wet stone. Thomas watched the yellow light from their flashlights move across the cave. The light did not reach his corner. After a few minutes, the men walked deeper into a side tunnel. Their voices became softer until Thomas could only hear the sound of the crashing waves. Thomas waited for a long moment. Then, he turned on his own flashlight. He kept the light very low. He looked around the area where the men were standing just moments ago. He saw a flat piece of rock that looked like a natural table. On top of the rock, there was a heavy wooden box. The box was about the size of a suitcase. It was made of dark wood and had thick metal corners. It looked very old and very heavy. Thomas walked to the box and touched the wood. It was wet from the salt air. There was no lock on the box, only a simple metal latch. Thomas lifted the lid slowly. He tried to be as quiet as possible. The metal latch made a tiny scraping noise, but the sound of the ocean covered it. When he opened the lid, his eyes grew wide. The beam of his flashlight hit something very bright. Inside the box, there were dozens of expensive watches. They were gold and silver, and they sparkled in the light. Under the watches, there were small bags made of cloth. Thomas opened one bag and saw many gold coins. He had never seen so much money in his entire life. "This is not a fisherman's secret," Thomas whispered. "This is a smuggling operation." He realized now why Mr. Gable was so afraid. The previous keeper found this box, or he saw the men bringing it into the cave. This was why the radio wires were cut. The criminals did not want anyone to call the police. They wanted to keep their treasure hidden in the caves under the lighthouse. Thomas heard a footstep in the distance. The men were coming back. He quickly closed the lid of the box. He turned off his flashlight and moved back into the shadows of the main tunnel. He felt a cold fear in his stomach. He was just a sailor with a knife, and he was fighting against powerful men with a dark secret. He had to get back to the lighthouse. He had to find a way to protect himself before the men discovered he was there. He turned and started to walk back through the dark tunnel, moving as fast as he could in the mud. He knew that if the mayor found him, Thomas would disappear just like Mr. Gable. Thomas climbed the stone stairs under the trapdoor as fast as he could. His heart was hitting his ribs like a hammer. He reached the kitchen and pulled the heavy wooden trapdoor shut. He moved the blue rug back into its place. Then, he pushed the heavy wooden table over the rug. He was breathing very hard, and his hands were shaking from the cold and the fear. He needed to see what was happening outside. He went to the small window in the kitchen and looked out. The mist was very thick now. It was like a white blanket over the black ocean. He could see the stone dock, but only just. The old wood of the dock was dark and wet from the spray of the waves. Suddenly, a small boat appeared through the white mist. It did not have any lights on it. It moved slowly and quietly toward the dock. Thomas watched the boat hit the wooden edge. There was a low, dull noise of wood hitting wood. A man jumped out of the boat and onto the dock. He was tall and wore a black leather jacket and heavy trousers. Thomas picked up his binoculars from the shelf. He looked through the glass lenses. The man turned his head to look at the lighthouse. He had a very large, white scar on his left cheek. The scar went from his eye all the way down to his chin. His face looked hard and very mean. This was Victor. Thomas felt sure that this man was a person who used violence to get what he wanted. Victor tied the boat to the dock with a thick rope. He looked up at the lighthouse again. He seemed to be looking directly at the kitchen window. Thomas moved back into the shadows quickly. He stood against the wall and waited. He did not want Victor to see him watching. A few moments later, the mayor and the other man from the cave came out from behind a large rock near the shore. They walked quickly to the dock. They started talking to Victor. Thomas could not hear their words because of the wind and the constant sound of the waves. The wind was getting much stronger now. It made a high, whistling sound as it moved through the tall grass on the cliff. Victor pointed toward the sea caves. He looked very angry. He used his hands to show that something was wrong. The mayor looked nervous. He kept looking over his shoulder toward the lighthouse door. Thomas realized they were worried about the treasure in the cave. They did not know that Thomas already saw the gold and the watches. Thomas went to the front door of the lighthouse and checked the lock again. He felt very small inside the big stone tower. He had no friends on this island. He had no phone or working radio. He was alone with 3 criminals on a dark, wet night. He thought about the diary and Elena's brother. He needed to find a way to stop these men before they found him. But first, he had to stay hidden. He decided to go to the upper floor. He wanted to watch them from a higher place where they could not see his face. He walked to the stairs and began to climb. Thomas climbed the last few steps to the top of the lighthouse. He opened the heavy door and stepped out onto the metal balcony. The wind hit him with a powerful force. It was so strong that he had to hold the iron railing with both hands. The air was freezing and filled with tiny drops of salt water. Above him, the giant glass lamp continued its slow, steady circle. The bright beam of light cut through the thick mist every few seconds. He stayed in the darkest corner of the balcony. He sat on the floor so the metal railing hid his body. He took out his binoculars and looked down at the dock. The scene below was clear now. The white light of the lighthouse beam moved across the dock every 10 seconds, revealing the men like a flash of lightning. Victor was standing in the middle of the dock. He was much taller than the mayor. His face was twisted in anger. He was shouting, though Thomas could not hear the words over the roar of the ocean. Victor pointed his finger toward the sea caves and then toward the lighthouse. He looked like he wanted to break something. The mayor, Mr. Henderson, looked very small and weak next to him. He was shaking his head and holding his hat against the wind. The third man stood nearby. He was a short, thick man with a heavy beard. He carried a large metal flashlight and a heavy rope. Suddenly, Victor grabbed the mayor by the front of his coat. He pulled the mayor close to his face. Thomas saw the mayor's legs go weak. Victor was clearly the leader of this group. He let go of the mayor and pointed at the lighthouse door. The 3 men started walking up the narrow, rocky path. Their boots made a heavy, rhythmic sound as they hit the wet stones. "They are coming here," Thomas whispered. He felt a cold wave of fear in his chest. He was one old man against 3 younger, stronger men. He knew they were not coming for tea. They were coming because they were worried about their secret gold and watches. They probably thought Mr. Gable was the only person who knew about the caves. Now, they wanted to make sure the new keeper stayed quiet. Thomas looked around the balcony. There was nowhere to hide here. He had to go back inside. He had to find a way to stop them from entering. He remembered the heavy iron bolt on the front door. But he knew that a strong man like Victor could break a door if he had the right tools. He looked out at the sea one last time. The black boat was still there, sitting low in the water. It was waiting for the treasure. Thomas realized that he was the only thing standing between the criminals and their money. He stood up quickly and went back inside the tower. He closed the balcony door and locked it tight. He had to be smart. He had to use the lighthouse itself to protect himself. Thomas ran down the stairs to the second floor. He did not turn on his flashlight. He knew the building well enough now to move in the dark. He went to the small window in the bedroom. From here, he could see the front of the lighthouse and the start of the stone path. The three men stopped near a large, flat stone about 20 meters from the door. They were waiting for someone. A moment later, a figure moved out from the shadows of the tool shed. It was Elena. She walked toward the men slowly. She did not look afraid, but her face was very tight. Thomas watched through the glass. He felt a sudden pain in his heart. Was Elena working with them? Did she lie to him about her brother? He watched closely as she reached Victor. Victor stepped forward. He was much taller than Elena. He looked down at her with a mean smile. He said something, but the wind was too loud for Thomas to hear. Elena shook her head. She pointed toward the sea caves. Victor reached out and grabbed her arm very tightly. Elena tried to pull away, but he was too strong. The mayor stood behind Victor. He looked very nervous. He kept touching his grey hat and looking at the ground. He did not like the violence, but he did not stop Victor. "Where is the box?" Victor shouted. His voice was so loud that a few words reached Thomas through the wind. "The box is not in the cave. Someone moved it." Elena looked surprised. "I did not touch it," she said. Her voice was high and sharp. "I told you I was looking for my brother's things. I do not want your gold." Victor did not believe her. He pushed her toward the mayor. "Watch her," Victor ordered. He turned his head and looked directly at the lighthouse door. If the girl didn't take it, then the old sailor did. "He has been here for 2 days. He is too curious." Thomas moved away from the window. His heart was racing. He was the one they wanted now. They knew the treasure was missing from its spot in the cave. They thought Thomas had it. But Thomas knew the box was still in the cave when he left it. If it was gone now, someone else was playing a game. He heard the sound of heavy boots hitting the wooden front door. The wood was thick, but the whole lighthouse seemed to shake. The men were trying to break the lock. Thomas knew the iron bolt would only hold for a short time. He had to think fast. He could not run outside because the men were at the door. He could not go to the basement because they would find him there. He looked at the stairs leading up. The only way was up into the tower. He had to lead them away from the kitchen and the trapdoor. He grabbed a heavy metal bar from the side of the bed. It was a tool for the stove, but it was a good weapon. He started to climb the stairs again, moving toward the 3rd floor. He hoped Elena would be okay with the mayor, but he had to save himself first. Thomas reached the 3rd floor living room. He did not turn on the light. The room was dark, but the moon provided a little bit of grey light through the window. Downstairs, the sound of the front door was very loud. He heard a heavy piece of wood crack. Then, he heard a loud metallic snap as the iron bolt finally failed. The men were inside. "He is in here somewhere," Victor shouted. His voice moved up the stone stairs like a cold wind. "Check the kitchen. Check the basement." Thomas knew he had only a few minutes before they came up to the 3rd floor. He looked around the room. He saw an old wooden cabinet in the corner. He went to it and opened the small door. Inside, there were several old nautical charts and some pieces of paper. He started to look through them quickly. He found a small, yellow piece of paper. It was not a full map. It was a torn piece of a larger drawing. Thomas held it close to the window to see it better. The paper showed the base of the cliff and the lighthouse. There were lines drawn in dark red ink. These lines went through the sea caves and led to a small, hidden beach on the other side of the rocky point. A secret path. Thomas whispered. Near the end of the red line, there was a small X and a word written in very small letters. "The High Room." Thomas realized this map did not show the main cave where he saw the gold box. It showed a different, higher cave that stayed dry even during high tide. This was likely where the real treasure was kept. Or perhaps, this was where Mr. Gable was hiding. The sound of boots on the stone stairs was getting louder. They were moving past the second floor now. Thomas felt his heart pounding in his ears. He folded the piece of map and put it into his boot. He wanted to make sure they did not find it if they caught him. He looked at the window. It was too small for an adult man to climb through, and the drop to the rocks was too far. He looked at the ceiling. There was a small wooden ladder that led to the green door he could not open earlier. He decided he had to try that door again. He ran to the ladder and climbed up. He reached the small landing in front of the green door. He did not have the key, but he had the heavy metal stove bar in his hand. He used the end of the bar and pushed it into the space between the door and the wall. He pulled with all his strength. The wood made a long, complaining noise. The metal bands on the door did not move, but the old lock was weak. With one final push, the lock broke. Thomas pushed the door open and stepped inside. He closed the door behind him and moved a heavy box in front of it. He was now in the room that was a secret to everyone. Thomas stepped inside the small room and pushed a heavy wooden crate against the door. The room was tiny and smelled like old oil and warm metal. This was the internal maintenance room for the great lighthouse lamp. From here, Thomas could see the back of the massive glass lenses. The light was very bright, and it moved in a slow, steady circle. He walked toward the center of the room. He wanted to see the machinery that turned the light. As he looked at the metal frame of the lamp, he noticed something very unusual. Attached to the side of the glass was a small, round object. It was made of black plastic and had a tiny glass lens. It was a modern camera. Thomas was shocked. This lighthouse was very old, but this camera was new. He looked closely at it. The camera was not pointed at the sea. It was pointed at the internal gallery where the keeper worked. They were watching Mr. Gable. Thomas whispered. He realized that the criminals did not just wait for signals. They watched the lighthouse keeper every minute of the day. They knew when he was sleeping, when he was eating, and when he was looking at the sea. This was how they moved the gold without being caught. They had eyes inside the tower. Thomas looked at the back of the camera. There were two very thin wires. He followed the wires with his eyes. They went into a small hole in the stone wall and disappeared toward the attic above. He felt a cold shiver. If the camera was still working, Victor and the mayor could see him right now. They knew exactly where he was hiding. Suddenly, the green door behind him shook with a powerful force. Victor was hitting the wood with something heavy, perhaps a hammer or a large rock. "I know you found the room, sailor." Victor's voice was loud and full of anger. "There is no way out. Give us the map and the gold." Thomas looked around the small room. He was trapped. There were no windows, only the thick glass of the lantern. But then, he looked up. In the ceiling, there was a small iron hatch. It was used by workers to reach the very top of the lighthouse roof. He moved the small ladder to the center of the room. He climbed up and reached for the iron handle of the hatch. It was rusty and very cold. He pulled with all his strength. The hatch moved a little bit. He pulled again. Below him, the green door began to crack. A piece of wood fell to the floor. Thomas could see Victor's angry eyes through the hole in the door. Thomas gave one final, desperate pull. The hatch opened, and the freezing night wind rushed into the room. He climbed through the hole and onto the roof of the lighthouse. He was now at the highest point of Stormy Point, surrounded by the dark, screaming storm. Thomas stood on the flat roof of the lighthouse. The wind was very powerful. It felt like a giant hand was trying to push him off the edge. He stayed low and crawled toward the metal railing. He looked down at the ground far below. The white beam of the lighthouse lamp moved across the grass every few seconds. From his high position, Thomas saw the short man with the heavy beard. The man was standing near the kitchen window. He looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then, he picked up a large, heavy stone from the path. He threw the stone with great force. A sharp, high noise of breaking glass reached Thomas, even over the sound of the wind. The kitchen window was now a hole of jagged pieces. The man did not enter the house. Instead, he turned and ran back toward the dark shadows of the tool shed. What is he doing? Thomas wondered. Inside the tower, the noise of Victor hitting the green door stopped. It was suddenly very quiet. Thomas waited. He heard Victor's heavy boots moving away from the door and down the stairs. Victor must have heard the glass break too. He was probably going to investigate the kitchen. Thomas knew this was his chance. He could not stay on the roof forever. The cold was beginning to make his fingers numb. He opened the iron hatch and climbed back down the ladder into the maintenance room. He moved the heavy crate away from the green door. He pushed the door open slowly. The hallway was empty. He walked down the spiral stairs with great care. He did not use his flashlight. He stayed close to the wall. When he reached the first floor, he stayed in the shadows of the hallway and looked into the kitchen. The room was a mess. There was glass everywhere on the floor. It sparkled like ice in the moonlight. The cold night air was blowing into the room through the broken window. Thomas saw the large stone lying on the blue rug. There was a piece of dirty white paper tied to the stone with a piece of brown string. Thomas looked toward the front door. It was open, and the wind was moving it back and forth. Victor and the mayor were not in the room. He could hear them shouting outside near the dock. They were arguing with the short man. Thomas ran to the center of the room. He knelt on the rug and untied the string. His hands were shaking. He picked up the paper and smoothed it out on the table. The paper was torn at the edges, and the writing was done with a thick, black marker. He read the words quickly. His eyes grew wide. The message was a clear threat. It did not come from a friend. It was a final warning from the people who controlled the black boat. Thomas realized that the situation was much more dangerous than he thought. The criminals were losing their patience. Thomas held the piece of paper in his hands. The kitchen was very cold because of the broken window. The wind blew through the hole and moved the edges of the paper. The writing was large and very dark. It looked like the person who wrote it was very angry. The note said, "Give us the box. If you do not, you will vanish like Gable. We are watching." Thomas felt a heavy weight in his stomach. He looked at the word vanish. It was a scary word. It meant that Mr. Gable did not leave the island by choice. Something bad happened to him. Thomas thought about the empty boots and the money in the bedroom. Mr. Gable was probably taken by force because he knew too much about the gold. "They think I have the box," Thomas whispered to himself. He looked at the broken glass on the floor. He realized the short man threw the stone to get his attention. It was a message to show him that they could reach him at any time. The lighthouse was not a fortress. It was a cage. Thomas heard the sound of voices outside. Victor and the mayor were walking back toward the front door. Their boots made a crunching noise on the small rocks of the path. Thomas knew he could not stay in the kitchen. If they found him there with the note, they would know he was searching for their secrets. He looked at the torn map he hid in his boot. He remembered the X and the words "the high room." He realized that the box he saw in the cave was likely a trap or just a small part of the treasure. The real box they wanted was something else. Perhaps it was the government papers he saw in his earlier thoughts about the outline. Thomas moved quickly. He did not go to the stairs. Instead, he went to the small pantry behind the kitchen. He hid behind a large wooden barrel of flour. He held his breath. A moment later, Victor and the mayor entered the kitchen. "Look at this mess," the mayor said. His voice was shaking. "Victor, this is too much. We just wanted the money. We did not want to hurt anyone else." "Shut up, Henderson," Victor replied. His voice was like a growl. "Gable was a problem. And this new man is a problem too. He is hiding somewhere. I saw the maintenance hatch open on the roof. He is clever. But he is old. He cannot run forever." Thomas saw Victor's shadow move across the pantry door. Victor picked up the stone from the floor and read the note. He laughed. But it was not a happy sound. It was a cold and cruel laugh. "The boss is getting impatient," Victor said. "If we don't find that box tonight, the boat will leave without us. And if the boat leaves, we are all dead men." Thomas realized the stakes were higher than gold. These men were afraid of someone even more dangerous. He stayed perfectly still in the dark pantry, waiting for them to leave so he could make his next move. Thomas waited in the pantry for a long time. His legs were tired, and his back was stiff. Finally, he heard the men walk away. They went toward the stone stairs. Their voices became quiet as they climbed higher into the tower. Thomas knew he had to move now. He could not stay in the lighthouse. It was too easy for them to find him there. He stepped out of the pantry. He looked at the broken window. He did not go out the front door because it was too loud. Instead, he climbed through the broken kitchen window. The glass was sharp, so he moved slowly. He dropped onto the wet grass outside. The cold wind hit his face. It felt fresh after the dusty air of the lighthouse. Thomas walked toward the shore. He followed the edge of the cliff. The moon was behind a cloud, but he could see the white foam of the waves hitting the rocks below. He remembered the torn map in his boot. It showed a path near the sea caves. He walked carefully because the grass was slippery from the rain. Suddenly, he saw something strange near a tall, black rock. There was a small mound of earth in a quiet corner of the cliff. On top of the mound, there was a simple wooden cross. It was made of 2 pieces of old boat wood. Someone had tied them together with a piece of thick rope. Thomas walked to the cross. He knelt in the wet sand and dirt. There was a name written on the wood with a dark pencil. It said, Arthur Gable. Under the name, there was a date from only 1 month ago. Is he buried here? Thomas thought. He felt a deep sadness. Mr. Gable was a man he never met, but he felt like he knew him from the diary. Thomas touched the earth. It was very soft. It did not feel like the hard, packed ground of the cliff. He used his hands to move some of the dirt. He expected to find something heavy or a wooden box. He dug deeper into the cold ground. His fingers hit something flat, but it was just a piece of old plywood. He pulled the plywood away. Underneath, there was only a small, empty hole. There was no person inside. There was no coffin. The grave was empty. Why would someone make a fake grave? Thomas asked himself. He realized the truth. The criminals wanted the people in the village to think Mr. Gable was dead. If there was a grave, the police would not search for a missing person. They would think it was just a sad story. But if the grave was empty, then where was Mr. Gable? Was he still alive? Was he a prisoner? Thomas stood up and wiped the dirt from his hands. He looked at the dark lighthouse. He looked at the Black Sea. The mystery was growing bigger. He was not just looking for gold or secrets anymore. He was looking for a man who might still be out there in the dark. Thomas stood by the empty grave for a long time. The wind was getting colder, and the salt from the sea felt sharp on his skin. He heard a soft movement in the grass behind him. He turned quickly, holding his heavy metal bar. It was Elena. She was breathing fast, and her face was very pale in the moonlight. Thomas. I saw you jump from the window. She whispered. She looked at the hole in the ground. Her eyes grew wide when she saw it was empty. Why is there no body? I thought they killed him. It is a fake grave. Elena. Thomas said. He walked closer to her. They want the town to think he is dead so the police do not look for him. But I need to know the truth. Who is the man with the scar? Who is Victor? Elena looked toward the lighthouse. She looked very afraid. She pulled her coat tighter around her body. Victor is a dangerous man from the city. She explained. He was in prison for a long time because he stole gold from a bank. My brother, Peter, told me about him. Victor thinks there is a secret map hidden in this lighthouse. He thinks the map shows where the bank robbers hid their money years ago. The mayor is helping him. Thomas said. Elena nodded. Mr. Henderson owes a lot of money to bad people. He is desperate. He let Victor come here because he wants a part of the gold. But Victor does not like to share. He is cruel. Thomas. He does not care about lives. He only cares about the box. Thomas thought about the torn map in his boot. He now understood why the criminals were so angry. They were looking for a map that he already found. But he did not tell Elena about the map yet. He wanted to be sure he could trust her. Do you think your brother and Mr. Gable are still alive? Thomas asked. I hope so. Elena said. Her voice was shaking. But Victor is losing his patience. The black boat in the sea is waiting for him. If he does not find the treasure tonight, he will leave, and he will not leave any witnesses behind. We are in great danger. Suddenly, a light moved across the grass from the direction of the tool shed. It was the short man with the beard. He was looking for them. Thomas grabbed Elena's hand. We cannot stay here. Thomas said. We need to hide near the cliffs. There is a path in the sea caves that stays dry. I saw it earlier. They moved quietly through the tall grass. Thomas looked back at the lighthouse one last time. The great lamp continued to turn, sending its white light over the empty grave. The mystery of Stormy Point was no longer just about gold. It was a fight to stay alive. Thomas led Elena to a small, dry crevice between two large rocks near the sea caves. Stay here. He whispered. The short man is searching the grass, but he cannot see you in the shadows. I must go back into the lighthouse. I found a camera in the lamp room, and I need to see where the wires lead. Elena grabbed his sleeve. It is too dangerous. Thomas. Victor and the mayor are still inside. I know. Thomas replied, his voice firm. But they are looking for the gold box. They will be in the basement or the kitchen. I will use the maintenance hatch to move between the floors. I need to know who is watching us. Thomas moved like a shadow across the wet grass. He reached the lighthouse and climbed back through the broken kitchen window. He listened carefully. He heard the heavy sound of the mayor's voice from the basement. They were still arguing about the missing money. Thomas climbed the stairs quickly but quietly. He reached the maintenance room below the great lamp. He looked at the small black camera again. The tiny red light on it was still glowing. He followed the two thin wires. They disappeared into a small, dark hole in the stone ceiling. He knew that above this room was the attic. The attic was a place where old lighthouse equipment was kept. It was a dusty, forgotten space. Thomas went to the hallway and found a small wooden panel in the ceiling. He pushed it open and pulled down a folding ladder. The air in the attic was very dry and smelled of old paper. Thomas climbed up and turned on his flashlight, but he kept the beam very small. He followed the wires across the wooden floor. They were taped neatly to the floorboards. They led to a corner of the room behind a stack of empty wooden crates. Thomas moved the crates slowly. Behind them, he did not find old tools. Instead, he found a modern metal desk. On the desk, there was a small glowing computer screen and a set of professional headphones. The screen was divided into 4 small pictures. Thomas felt a cold shock. One picture showed the kitchen. Another showed the maintenance room where he was just minutes ago. The third picture showed the front door. The fourth picture showed the path to the sea caves. He could see Elena's hiding spot, though she was hidden well in the shadows. Someone has been living up here, Thomas whispered. He looked at the desk. There was a small leather notebook. He opened it and saw pages of notes about his own daily routine. It listed the time he woke up, the time he ate his lunch, and the time he went to the balcony. At the bottom of the last page, there was a name written in bold red ink. Officer Miller. Thomas froze. Miller was the police officer from the mainland who visited the village. He was the man who was supposed to protect the people. Thomas realized that the criminals had a friend in the police. This was why the local police never found Mr. Gable. The man who was watching the lighthouse was the same man who was supposed to solve the mystery. Thomas stood in the dark attic. He was very afraid. Officer Miller was not a friend. He was a spy. Thomas looked at the small computer screen one last time. He saw the storm outside through a tiny window. It was getting much worse. The sky was completely black, and the wind hit the lighthouse with a great force. Thomas knew he had to move. He could not stay in the attic. If Officer Miller came back to check his cameras, Thomas would be trapped in the corner. He climbed down the folding ladder very slowly. He tried not to make any noise. He went past the maintenance room and stayed in the shadows of the hallway. He heard voices coming from the floor below. Victor and the mayor were in the living room now. They sounded very worried. "The storm is here," the mayor cried. His voice was high and thin. "The waves are too big. We cannot wait for the boat to come to the dock. The boat will hit the rocks and break." "I do not care about the boat," Victor growled. His voice was deep and mean. "The boss is coming. We must go to the sea caves now. We need to find that box before the water fills the tunnel." "But the tide is rising," the mayor said. "The lower caves are dangerous when the tide is high. We could drown." "Then move faster," Victor replied. Thomas heard their heavy boots moving down the stone stairs. A moment later, he heard the heavy front door open and then close. The wind was so loud it sounded like a giant screaming against the stone walls of the tower. Thomas ran down the remaining stairs. He reached the kitchen and looked out of the broken window. The rain was like a thick white wall of water. He could barely see the stone path. He knew Elena was still waiting near the rocks. She was in great danger. If the tide was rising, her hiding spot would soon be under the freezing ocean. He climbed out of the kitchen window again. The rain was very cold, and it made his clothes wet in only 1 second. The ground was now very muddy and slippery. Thomas ran toward the cliffs, using his hands to stay steady on the wet grass. He slipped and fell once, hitting his knee on a rock, but he got up quickly. He reached the crevice where he left Elena. "Elena!" he shouted. The wind was so powerful that it took his voice away. He moved closer to the edge of the rocks. She was standing on a high rock. The water was already touching the bottom of her boots. The sea was white with foam and looked very angry. "Thomas!" she called back. She pointed toward the sea. Through the thick rain, Thomas saw the black boat. It was much closer to the shore now. It was moving toward the dark entrance of the sea caves. A green light flashed from the deck of the boat. Then, a white light flashed from the beach below them. The criminals were already there, and the water was rising every minute. Thomas grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her up toward the higher ground. "We can't stay here," he yelled over the thunder. "The map. I found a map." He pulled the torn paper from his boot. It was wet, but the red ink still glowed in the light of his flashlight. It shows a path to the high room, Thomas explained, pointing to the jagged lines. It's a cave that the tide cannot reach. That's where the map leads. If your brother or Gable are anywhere, it's there. They scrambled across the slippery rocks, moving away from the main dock where the black boat was attempting to land. Thomas found the landmark from the map, a rock shaped like a jagged tooth. Behind it was a narrow opening, half hidden by thick, wet seaweed. It didn't look like an entrance, but the map was clear. They squeezed through the opening. Inside, the air was suddenly still, though the roar of the ocean still echoed through the stone. This tunnel was different from the muddy one under the kitchen. It was carved by hand, with smooth walls and a floor that sloped upward, away from the reaching waves. Inside the cliff, the path. The tunnel spiraled deeper into the heart of the cliff, moving parallel to the lighthouse stairs but hidden behind meters of solid rock. The sound. As they climbed, Thomas heard the muffled sound of a powerful engine. The black boat was entering the main cavern directly below them. The light. A faint, flickering light appeared ahead. It wasn't the neon green of the smugglers or the harsh white of the lighthouse. It was a warm, orange glow, like a candle or an old oil lamp. Someone is already here, Elena whispered, her hand trembling as she gripped Thomas's coat. Thomas gripped his metal bar. They moved toward the light, their shadows stretching long and thin against the damp walls. At the end of the tunnel, the space opened into a wide, dry chamber. It was filled with old wooden crates, but these weren't full of watches or gold. They were filled with books, navigation charts, and a small, neat cot. Sitting on the cot, holding a small lantern, was an older man with white hair and a very tired face. He looked up, his eyes blinking in the light of Thomas's flashlight. He didn't look like a prisoner. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a long time. "You're late for your shift, Thomas," the man said with a weak, knowing smile. It was Arthur Gable. He wasn't a ghost, and he wasn't at the bottom of the sea. He had been hiding in the one place the cameras couldn't see. Arthur Gable stood up slowly. His movements were stiff, like a man who had spent too many nights in the damp cold. He looked at Elena and then back to Thomas. He recognized the look of confusion and fear in their eyes. "I know what you're thinking," Gable said, his voice raspy. "I'm supposed to be at the bottom of the Atlantic. That was the plan, anyway. If they think you're dead, they stop looking for you. But I couldn't leave the lighthouse. Not while they were still using it for their poison. They think you have the box, Mr. Gable," Thomas said, stepping into the room. "Victor, the mayor, even Officer Miller. I found the cameras in the attic." Gable's face hardened. "Miller. I suspected him the most. He was the one who investigated the first disappearance. He's the bridge between the smugglers and the mainland. But they don't want a box of watches, Thomas. They want the Black Ledger. The layout of the cliffs." Gable pointed to a hand-drawn map pinned to the stone wall. It showed the vertical structure of the Stormy Point cliffs. "The main cave. This is where the boat docks at low tide. It's where the heavy cargo is moved. The high room. This chamber is an old smuggler's lookout from the 1800s. It's dry and invisible from the sea. The air vents. Small holes in the rock allow Gable to hear everything happening in the main cave below. The ledger contains the names." Gable whispered. "Every politician, every policeman, and every businessman involved in this shipping ring for the last 10 years. I found it hidden in the lighthouse basement walls months ago. When they realized I had it, they tried to kill me. I led them to the cliff edge, threw my coat into the sea, and doubled back into this tunnel." "And my brother?" Elena asked, her voice breaking. "Peter. Did he find the ledger too? Gable's expression softened with pity. Peter found the boat. He saw them unloading crates that weren't supposed to exist. He didn't have a secret room to hide in. Elena. He tried to run to the village, but Miller stopped him on the road. He's being held on the black boat. They're using him to make sure no one else in the village talks. A loud, metallic clang echoed up through the floor. The sound was followed by the angry shouting of Victor. The smugglers had reached the base of the secret tunnel. "They're coming," Thomas said, gripping his metal bar. "The tide is high, and they have nowhere else to go but up. They'll find the opening to this room in minutes." Gable reached under his cot and pulled out a small, heavy iron box. It wasn't full of gold. It was full of paper. "This is the ledger. If Victor gets this, he'll burn it, and Peter will never come home. We have to get to the top of the tower. If we can signal the Coast Guard with the great lamp, not the usual white beam, but the red emergency filter, they'll send the cutters from the mainland. But the red filter is in the maintenance room." Thomas remembered. "And Miller is watching the cameras. Then we have to give him something else to look at," Gable said, his eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp energy. Thomas looked at the iron box in Gable's hands. It was the key to everything. "If Miller is watching the cameras," Thomas said, "he'll see us the moment we step into the maintenance room. We need to cut the power to his screens without him realizing we're there." Gable nodded and pointed toward a small, rusted lever near the ceiling of the high room. "This controls the old ventilation shutters. If we open them, the wind from the storm will blow directly into the attic through the floor vents. It will create a cloud of dust and old insulation. It won't stop the cameras, but it will blind them for a few minutes." The plan of attack. Thomas, Elena, and Gable moved with a singular purpose. They couldn't afford a single mistake. Step 1. Gable would stay in the tunnel to trigger the shutters. Step 2. Thomas would climb back through the maintenance hatch to reach the attic. Step 3. Elena would go to the second floor to create a noise distraction, drawing Victor and the mayor away from the stairs. "Be careful, Elena," Thomas whispered. She gave him a short, determined nod and disappeared into the lower dark of the tunnel. Thomas climbed the internal ladder toward the maintenance hatch. He felt the vibration of the great lamp turning above him. As Gable pulled the lever, a sudden roar filled the cliff. The wind screamed through the vents, and a thick, grey cloud of dust exploded into the maintenance room. Thomas pushed the hatch open and climbed through. He couldn't see more than a meter in front of him. He moved toward the folding ladder that led to the attic. He could hear Officer Miller coughing and cursing upstairs. The dust was working. He reached the attic floor and stayed low. Through the swirling grey air, he saw the glow of the computer monitors. Miller was standing up, wiping his eyes and hitting the screens with his hand, trying to clear the interference. Thomas reached the desk. He didn't have time to be subtle. He grabbed the heavy metal stove bar and swung it with all his might. The computer monitors shattered in a spray of glass and sparks. The attic went dark, except for the small red light of the cameras, which flickered and died. "Who's there?" "Oh," Miller shouted, reaching for his belt. Thomas didn't stay to answer. He turned and ran for the stairs leading to the lantern room. He had to reach the red filter before Miller found his flashlight. Below him, he heard a scream. It was Elena. Victor had found her. Thomas's heart felt like it was going to burst. Elena's scream echoed up the central shaft of the lighthouse, a sharp sound of terror that cut through the roar of the storm. He wanted to run down to the second floor, to throw himself at Victor, but he remembered Gable's words. "If we don't signal the Coast Guard, nobody leaves this island." He scrambled up the final steps into the lantern room. The great lamp was a magnificent, rotating wall of glass, spinning slowly on its bed of mercury. Usually, It cast a pure, blinding white light. But on the wall behind the pedestal, tucked into a protective metal housing, was the emergency filter, a massive, curved sheet of thick, ruby-red glass. Thomas grabbed the iron handle of the filter housing. It hadn't been moved in years. It was rusted tight. He pulled with every ounce of strength in his arms, his boots sliding on the metal floor. "Come on," he hissed. Behind him, the hatch from the attic flew open. Officer Miller scrambled out, his face covered in grey dust and his eyes red with rage. He was holding a heavy service pistol. "Step away from the lamp, Thomas," Miller shouted. The wind howling through the broken attic windows made his voice sound distant. Thomas didn't stop. He threw his entire body weight against the handle. With a loud, metallic crack, the rust snapped. The red glass sleeve slid forward on its tracks, clicking into place around the rotating lenses. Instantly, the world changed. The blinding white light was gone, replaced by a deep, ominous crimson. The beam that swept across the storm-tossed sea was now the color of blood, the international signal for a lighthouse in distress. Miller fired. The bullet shattered a small pane of glass near Thomas's head, showering him with shards. Thomas dove behind the heavy metal pedestal of the lamp. "You're a dead man," Miller yelled, moving around the rotating machinery. "You think a red light matters? The boat is already at the dock. Victor is taking the girl and the ledger, and we're burning this tower to the ground." Suddenly, the lighthouse shook. It wasn't the wind. A deep, booming sound, like a heavy cannon, echoed from the sea. Thomas peeked around the pedestal. Far out on the horizon, beyond the smuggler's black boat, a new light appeared. It wasn't a signal or a flash. It was a massive, blue-white searchlight cutting through the rain. The Coast Guard cutter Aegis had been patrolling 5 miles out. They had seen the sudden change from white to red. They weren't coming for a routine check. They were coming at full speed, their engines thumping like a giant's heartbeat. Miller saw the searchlight too. His face went pale. He knew he couldn't hide a red lighthouse from a federal ship. He turned toward the stairs, intending to run, but a shadow blocked his path. Arthur Gable stood at the top of the stairs, holding a heavy brass flare gun he had taken from the high room. "The shift is over, Miller," Gable said firmly. But downstairs, the danger was far from over. Victor still had Elena, and he was seconds away from reaching the black boat. Thomas didn't wait to see Miller surrender. He trusted Gable's steady hand with the flare gun. He spun around and sprinted down the spiral stairs, jumping 3 steps at a time. His boots hammered against the stone, the sound echoing like a drum in the narrow shaft. Every second felt like an hour. He reached the kitchen. The room was freezing, the wind whistling through the broken window. He didn't stop. He burst through the front door and into the chaos of the storm. The rain was a horizontal wall of ice. Down at the dock, the black boat was bucking like a wild animal against the wooden pilings. The searchlight from the Coast Guard cutter was sweeping closer, turning the churning sea into a brilliant, silver wasteland. Thomas saw them. Victor was dragging Elena toward the boat's ramp. The mayor was already on board, huddled in the corner of the deck, his face buried in his hands. The short man with the beard was trying to untie the thick mooring ropes. "Victor!" Thomas screamed. The smuggler turned. The red light from the lighthouse tower above washed over his scarred face, making him look like a demon from an old sailor's tale. He pulled a long, serrated knife from his belt and held it to Elena's throat. "Stay back, old man," Victor roared. "One more step and she goes into the drink." Thomas stopped. He was 20 feet away, his chest heaving. He still held the heavy metal stove bar, but he knew he couldn't outrun a knife. Behind Victor, the massive prow of the Coast Guard cutter Aegis emerged from the mist, its siren beginning to wail, a deep, chest-shaking groan that signaled the end of the line. "It's over," Victor! Thomas shouted over the wind. The Coast Guard is here. The ledger is with Gable. You have nowhere to go. Victor looked at the approaching ship, then back at the lighthouse. His eyes were wild. He realized he was trapped between a federal hammer and a stone anvil. In that moment of hesitation, Elena didn't wait. She drove her elbow into Victor's ribs and bit down hard on his hand. Victor cursed and pulled back. Thomas didn't think. He acted. He sprinted across the slippery dock and swung the metal bar with a sailor's precision. The bar connected with Victor's wrist, sending the knife spinning into the dark water. A second later, the searchlight from the Aegis centered directly on the dock, freezing them all in a pillar of artificial noon. This is the United States Coast Guard. A voice boomed over a massive loudspeaker. Drop your weapons and put your hands in the air. You are under arrest. Victor looked at the massive ship, then at Thomas. He dropped to his knees, his spirit finally broken by the sheer scale of the force against him. The short man with the beard immediately threw up his hands. Armed officers in blue life jackets swarmed from the cutter's small boarding boat, which had slipped into the calmer water behind the dock. Within minutes, Victor, the mayor, and the short man were in handcuffs. Thomas grabbed Elena and pulled her into a hug. She was shaking, but she was alive. Peter! She gasped, looking toward the black boat. One of the Coast Guard officers emerged from the boat's cabin, leading a tired, bruised man in a torn fisherman's sweater. Elena let out a cry of joy and ran toward him. The mystery of the disappearances was solved. Thomas looked up at the lighthouse. High above, the red beam continued to sweep across the sky. He saw two figures standing on the balcony, Arthur Gable and a disarmed Officer Miller, waiting for the authorities to climb the tower. The storm was still raging, but for the first time in days, the air at Stormy Point felt clean. Epilogue. A week later, the sun was shining brightly over a calm, blue Atlantic. Thomas stood on the dock, watching a supply boat pull away. Arthur Gable stood beside him, wearing a fresh coat and looking 10 years younger. The government is turning the lighthouse into a historical site, Gable said, squinting at the horizon. They want me to help run the museum. And Elena's brother is back out on his boat today. He says he owes you his life. Thomas smiled. He looked at the tall white tower, its glass sparkling in the sun. I just wanted a quiet job. Arthur. Gable laughed and patted him on the shoulder. In this life, Thomas, the light doesn't just show the way for ships. It brings the truth out of the shadows. And you're a damn fine keeper of the truth. Thomas turned back toward the kitchen. He had a lot of cleaning to do, and for the first time, he was looking forward to the work. The arrest of Victor and Officer Miller brought a temporary peace to the island, but for Thomas, the silence felt hollow. As the Coast Guard cutters disappeared into the horizon, leaving only a small security detail behind, Thomas found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at the broken window. The glass had been replaced with plywood for now, but the draft still carried the scent of the coming winter. Arthur Gable sat at the wooden table, his fingers tracing the embossed leather of the black ledger. You think it's over, don't you? Gable asked without looking up. His voice was low, devoid of the relief Thomas felt. The leaders are in handcuffs. Arthur. Thomas replied, pouring 2 mugs of strong, black coffee. The mayor is talking to the feds, and Miller is headed for a dark cell. The black ledger is in our hands. What more is there? Gable finally looked up, his eyes reflecting the dim morning light. Victor was a blunt instrument. Thomas. He was a thief with a scar and a bad temper. But look at the names in this book. These aren't just local smugglers. There are signatures here from shipping magnates in London, port authorities in Singapore, and names that belong to the Syndicate, a shadow organization that has used this coastline for 50 years. Victor was a flea on the back of a very large, very angry dog. Thomas felt a familiar coldness return to his chest. He looked out at the mainland road. A lone black sedan was parked on the distant cliffside, its engine idling. It hadn't moved for 3 hours. It didn't belong to the police or the Coast Guard. They'll want the book back. Thomas whispered. They don't just want the book. Gable corrected. They want the lighthouse. I spent 20 years wondering why they chose Stormy Point. It's not just the caves. There's something built into the very foundation of this rock that they need. During the war, this place wasn't just a light. It was a listening post. There are frequencies, Thomas, that can be broadcast from this height that interfere with modern satellite tracking. If you control Stormy Point, you can make a fleet of ships disappear from every radar in the Atlantic. A knock at the door made both men jump. Thomas gripped the handle of his sailor's knife. But it was only Elena. She looked exhausted, her hair matted with dried salt. Thomas. Arthur. She panted. The village, it's crawling with investigators. They claim to be from the Maritime Heritage Board, but they're asking questions about the internal structure of the tower. They have blueprints. Thomas. Blueprints that show a sub-basement we haven't found yet. Thomas looked at Gable. The older man stood up, his face set in a grim mask. The victory of the previous night was fading fast. A new, more professional enemy was moving in, and they wouldn't be as loud or as clumsy as Victor. The investigators arrived at the lighthouse gates by noon. There were 4 of them, dressed in expensive outdoor gear that looked a bit too new. Their leader was a woman with sharp, analytical eyes and a voice like cold silk. She introduced herself as Diana Vane. Mr. Wicks, she said, flashing a badge that looked perfectly official. We've been sent to conduct a structural integrity audit following the unfortunate events of the past week. The Department of the Interior is concerned that the smugglers may have compromised the cliff stability. Thomas stood in the doorway, blocking her path. The Coast Guard did their sweep, Ms. Vane. The building is sound. With all due respect, she replied, stepping forward with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. The Coast Guard knows ships. We know stone. My team needs access to the lower levels immediately. Thomas looked past her at the black sedan parked near the tool shed. 2 men were unloading crates of equipment that didn't look like masonry tools. They looked like high-frequency scanners. Thomas knew he couldn't stop them legally without a direct order, so he stepped aside, his mind racing. While Vane's team moved into the basement with their humming machines, Thomas slipped into the high room to find Gable. The old keeper was hunched over the ledger, using a magnifying glass to study the margins of the pages. I found it, Gable whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. It's not just a list of names. Look at the page numbers. They've been altered. Thomas leaned in. The page numbers weren't sequential. They followed a mathematical pattern, specifically, a series of prime numbers. When Thomas aligned the numbers with a map of the lighthouse's original 1880 construction plans, a new shape emerged. It's a cipher, Thomas realized. The ledger is a key to a physical location inside the tower. Using a pencil, Thomas traced the coordinates revealed by the code. The lines intersected at a point exactly 3 meters below the kitchen floor, but skewed 10 degrees to the east, right beneath the massive central pillar that supported the weight of the entire stone tower. The sub-basement, Thomas said. Vane isn't here to check the walls. She knows exactly where the vanishing point is. If she finds the broadcast room, she can activate the jamming signal, and the syndicate's ships will be able to move $1 billion worth of contraband past the Coast Guard without being seen. We have to beat them to it, Gable said, grabbing a crowbar. But we can't go through the kitchen. Vane has a man stationed there. We have to use the sea caves. There's a ventilation shaft that leads upward from the back of the high room. It was built for the coal fires they used to use for the old lamp. Thomas looked at the ceiling of the small chamber. A rusted iron grate was hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was a narrow, vertical climb through 100 years of soot and darkness. The climb through the ventilation shaft was a nightmare of tight spaces and crumbling brick. Thomas went first, his fingers digging into the gaps between the stones. Every time he moved, a shower of black soot fell into his eyes and mouth. Behind him, he could hear Gable's heavy breathing. The old man was pushing himself to the limit. Almost there. Thomas wheezed. He reached a small iron platform. From here, he could hear the muffled sound of voices through the stone. He pressed his ear to the wall. The scanner is picking up a hollow space. A man's voice said. It was one of Vane's team. It's shielded with lead. That's why the Coast Guard missed it. If we blow the seal on this pillar, the whole room should be accessible. Don't use explosives yet. Diana Vane's voice cut in. We need the equipment intact. Use the thermal cutters. We have 3 hours before the next Coast Guard patrol comes within range of the signal. Thomas looked at Gable. The older man shook his head. If they used thermal cutters on the central pillar, they risked collapsing the entire lighthouse. Vane didn't care about the building. She only cared about the vanishing point. Thomas found a small, loose stone in the vent. He pulled it out, creating a tiny peephole into the sub-basement. Below him was a room that looked like it belonged in a science fiction novel. It was filled with vacuum tubes, copper wiring, and a massive, rotating brass drum covered in strange etchings. It was a mechanical computer from a different era, perfectly preserved by the dry, lead-lined walls. In the center of the room was a chair, and sitting in that chair was a man Thomas didn't expect to see. It was a man in an expensive suit, his back to the wall, his hands tied. Is that the CEO of Atlantic Shipping? Gable whispered, looking through the hole. They're not just smuggling. Thomas realized. They're kidnapping. The syndicate is clearing the board. They're replacing the heads of every major company with their own people, and they're using Stormy Point as the processing center. Suddenly, a red light began to pulse on the brass drum. The machine was waking up. A low, rhythmic hum began to vibrate through the stones of the lighthouse, a sound so deep it made Thomas's teeth ache. The signal. Gable gasped. They've started the broadcast. Far out at sea, the horizon began to shimmer. Thomas looked through a small slit in the outer wall. A massive cargo ship was approaching, but on the radar screen Vane's team had set up in the room below, the ocean appeared completely empty. The vanishing point was active, and Thomas was the only one close enough to pull the plug. Thomas watched through the peephole as the massive brass drum gained speed. The hum was no longer just a sound. It was a physical force that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. Diana Vane stood over the kidnapped CEO, her silhouette sharp against the pulsing red light of the vacuum tubes. She checked a silver watch on her wrist, her face a mask of cold professionalism. We need to cut the main feed. Gable whispered into Thomas's ear, his breath smelling of stale coffee and old stone. The brass drum is the amplifier, but the power comes from the lead oscillator, that small, shielded box at the base of the central pillar. If you can pull the master fuse, the signal will collapse, and the radar jamming will end instantly. Thomas didn't hesitate. He knew the ventilation grate was the only way in. He signaled Gable to hold the secondary rope. With a sharp kick, the rusted iron grate gave way, falling into the sub-basement. Thomas didn't wait for the guards to react. He dropped through the opening, landing hard on his feet and rolling into the shadows behind the rotating drum. Intruder! One of the guards screamed, reaching for a weapon. Thomas ignored him. He lunged toward the central pillar. The air near the machine was hot and smelled of ozone and scorched copper. He saw the lead oscillator, A heavy, rectangular box bolted to the floor. It was covered in warning labels from a bygone era. He grabbed the heavy iron handle of the master fuse. It was glowing with a faint blue light, the electricity humming through the metal. "Stop him!" Vane shouted, her voice cutting through the mechanical roar. Thomas felt a searing heat in his palms as he gripped the handle. He planted his feet and pulled with every ounce of strength he had left. The metal resisted, but Thomas didn't let go. With a blinding flash of white light, the fuse snapped free. The room was instantly plunged into darkness. The deep hum died away, replaced by the high-pitched whine of the brass drum spinning down. The red lights flickered and expired. For a moment, the only sound was the heavy breathing of the men in the room and the distant crash of waves against the cliff. Thomas stood his ground, the heavy fuse still in his hand. The blue glow was fading, but the heat remained. In the sudden silence, he heard the frantic tapping of a technician on a laptop nearby. "The signal is down," the man cried. "The cargo ship. It's back on the grid. Every Coast Guard station from here to Nova Scotia can see it now." Diana Vane stepped into the weak beam of a guard's flashlight. Her composure was gone, replaced by a terrifying, silent rage. She looked at Thomas, then at the smoking pillar. "You have no idea what you've just done, Mr. Wicks. You haven't saved anyone. You've just turned this lighthouse into a beacon for a war you aren't prepared to fight." The transition from the deafening roar of the machine to the silence of the sub-basement was jarring. Thomas looked at the kidnapped CEO, who was blinking in the sudden darkness. The man's eyes weren't filled with fear, but with a strange, calculating intensity. Before Thomas could move toward him, the guards closed in, their flashlights creating a chaotic lattice of light in the dusty air. "Grab the oscillator," Vane commanded. "If we can't broadcast, we take the hardware. We move to the secondary site." Thomas knew he couldn't fight four armed men in a confined space. He looked up at the ventilation shaft. Gable was leaning through the opening, dropping a heavy coil of rope. "Thomas, get up here. Now!" Thomas grabbed the rope just as a guard lunged for his legs. He kicked out, his heavy sailor's boot connecting with the man's jaw. He pulled himself upward, his muscles screaming in protest. As he climbed, he looked back down. The guards weren't chasing him. They were frantically unbolting the lead oscillator from the floor. They didn't care about the intruder anymore. They cared about the technology. He reached the vent and Gable hauled him into the darkness of the shaft. They scrambled back through the narrow tunnel, the soot once again filling their lungs. When they reached the high room, Thomas collapsed against the stone wall, gasping for air. "We have to get Elena," Thomas panted. "If they're moving to a secondary site, they'll clear the area. That means no witnesses." "I'm here," a voice whispered from the corner of the room. Elena stepped out of the shadows, her face streaked with dirt but her eyes bright. "I saw them. The black sedan is leaving, but two more trucks just arrived at the tool shed. They're blocking the only road off the point. We're cut off." "What about the Coast Guard?" Gable asked, clutching the black ledger to his chest. "They're busy," Thomas said, looking out the narrow slit of the high room toward the ocean. "The cargo ship I saw. It's stopped dead in the water. 3 Coast Guard cutters are surrounding it, but they aren't boarding. Something is wrong." Thomas picked up his binoculars. Through the glass, he saw the cargo ship's deck. It wasn't full of containers. It was covered in strange, silver-dome structures that looked like oversized satellite dishes. Even though the vanishing point in the lighthouse was dead, the ship itself was glowing with a faint, shimmering haze. The lighthouse was just the spark. Gable realized, his voice trembling. The ship is the actual transmitter. They used the lighthouse to mask its arrival, but now that it's here, it doesn't need us anymore. It's creating an invisible shield, a localized dead zone. Any ship or plane that enters that haze will simply disappear. Thomas realized the scale of the disaster. The syndicate wasn't just smuggling. They were creating a ghost corridor in the middle of one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. And they were using the Stormy Point Lighthouse as the anchor for the entire operation. Thomas, Elena, and Gable retreated deeper into the high room, the weight of the situation settling over them like the heavy coastal fog. Thomas held the master fuse he had ripped from the machine. It was a strange object, heavy, made of an alloy he didn't recognize, and etched with tiny, microscopic lines that looked less like wiring and more like a map. "We need to know who that man was," Thomas said, thinking of the CEO in the chair. Vane called him the head of Atlantic shipping, but his reaction to the machine failing, he wasn't relieved. He was angry. Because he's not the victim, Gable said, opening the black ledger to a hidden flap in the back cover. He pulled out a small, grain-of-rice-sized microchip. "He's the architect. The man down there is Julian Vane, Diana's brother. He didn't get kidnapped. He was field testing the integration of the human mind with the lead oscillator's frequency." Elena gasped. "You mean he was part of the machine?" "The syndicate isn't looking for gold, Elena," Gable explained, his voice grim. "They are looking for control. If they can broadcast a signal that masks a ship, they can broadcast a signal that masks a thought. They're testing a way to influence the crews of every ship in the Atlantic. Total maritime dominance." Thomas looked at the microchip, then at the master fuse. He realized the etched lines on the fuse matched the patterns on the chip. It wasn't just a map of the lighthouse. It was a blueprint for a global network. "We have to get this data to the mainland," Thomas said. "But the trucks are blocking the road, and the Coast Guard is occupied with the ghost ship at sea. We're the only ones who know the truth." Suddenly, a low, rhythmic tapping echoed through the stone floor. It was coming from the ventilation shaft. "It's Morse code," Thomas whispered. He listened intently. "It's coming from the sub-basement. Someone stayed behind." He leaned into the vent and listened. The message was short and repeated over and over. "The cellar?" Elena asked. "There is no cellar. We've checked every inch of the basement." "Not the lighthouse cellar," Gable said, his eyes widening with a sudden memory. "The old keeper's cottage. The one that burned down in 1924. The foundations are still there, buried under the tool shed. My predecessor told me there was a tunnel connecting the cottage to the lighthouse in case of a siege." Thomas stood up, his resolve hardening. "If the syndicate is blocking the road and the front door, we go out through the ghost of the past. If that tunnel still exists, it will come out behind the tool shed, right where the trucks are parked. We'll need a distraction," Elena said, looking at the great lamp above. "Something big enough to make them look at the tower while we move through the ground." Thomas looked at the red emergency filter. "I have an idea, but it's going to ruin the lighthouse forever." Thomas didn't like the idea of damaging the great lamp, but he knew they were out of options. The syndicate's professional team was far more dangerous than Victor's local thugs. To get past the trucks and the thermal cutting team, they needed a diversion that would do more than just draw eyes. It needed to blind them. The lamp is designed to project a beam for 20 miles. Thomas explained as he stood in the lantern room, his hands moving over the heavy brass controls. "But if I bypass the governor and force the rotation to triple its speed while increasing the voltage to the carbon arcs, it won't be a beam anymore. It will be a strobe. A strobe so powerful it'll burn out the sensors on their cameras and leave anyone looking at the tower temporarily blind." Arthur Gable looked pained. "You'll melt the copper bushings, Thomas. The friction alone will seize the mercury bath." "Better the mercury bath than our lives, Arthur," Thomas replied. He looked at Elena. As soon as the light starts pulsing, we have 3 minutes to get into the tunnel beneath the tool shed. If we're late, the lamp will likely explode, and the syndicate will come looking for the source of the failure. Thomas began the process. He stripped the insulation from the secondary power cables and bypassed the safety breakers. The air in the lantern room began to hum with a high-pitched, ozone-heavy vibration. He gripped the main lever. With a quick glance at his companions, he slammed it forward. The effect was instantaneous. The rotating lenses, usually a graceful dance of light, began to spin with a terrifying, mechanical scream. The red emergency filter made the room look like it was filled with liquid fire. Then, the white arc light ignited with a brilliance that was painful even through closed eyelids. The lighthouse didn't just shine, it throbbed. Every half-second, a pulse of light equivalent to 1,000,000 candles blasted into the night, reflecting off the thick fog and turning the entire island into a flickering, hallucinogenic nightmare. "Go! Now!" Thomas shouted. They scrambled down the stairs, their shadows dancing wildly against the stone walls as the strobe light leaked through every window. They burst out the side door, staying low in the tall grass. Down by the tool shed, Thomas saw the syndicate guards stumbling, their hands over their eyes, the rhythmic blinding flashes making it impossible for them to focus on anything. They reached the floor of the tool shed. Thomas kicked aside a pile of rusted anchors and found the rotted wooden trapdoor. "This is it," he whispered. He pulled it open, revealing a dark, vertical drop into the earth. The smell of 1924, smoke, damp rot, and ancient coal, rose to meet them. The tunnel was a narrow, claustrophobic ribcage of charred timber and cold stone. Thomas went first, his flashlight beam cutting through a century of spiderwebs. The floor was soft with ash and decomposed wood, muffling their footsteps as they moved away from the lighthouse. "Stay close," Thomas whispered. "The ceiling isn't stable." As they moved, they passed relics of the old keeper's life that had been swallowed by the earth during the Great Fire. A melted brass clock, a shattered porcelain tea set, and the blackened remains of a bookshelf. It was a graveyard of a different era. Above them, the dull vibration of the lighthouse strobe continued to pulse through the soil. But a new sound joined it, the heavy, metallic vibration of the syndicate's trucks. "They're right above us." Elena breathed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Tiny trickles of dirt fell between the floorboards of the cottage's old foundation. Thomas stopped. Directly ahead, the tunnel widened into what must have been the cottage cellar. Resting against the far wall was a series of heavy lead canisters, identical to the ones Thomas had seen in the sub-basement. They've been using this tunnel for years. Gable realized, his voice a ghost of a whisper. Victor wasn't the first. The syndicate has been staging the lead oscillators here since the war. This wasn't just a hiding spot, it was a warehouse. Thomas stepped forward to examine one of the canisters, but his boot hit something metallic and hollow. He shone his light down. It wasn't a canister. It was a human skeleton, dressed in the tattered remains of a 1920s lighthouse keeper's uniform. In the skeleton's hand was a small, leather-bound logbook, miraculously preserved by the lack of oxygen in the sealed chamber. "That's Silas Vance," Gable whispered, crossing himself. "The keeper who supposedly died in the fire." "He didn't die in the fire, Thomas. He was down here, trying to hide something." Thomas picked up the logbook. The last entry was dated October 14th, 1924. It read, "The frequency is alive. It speaks in the voices of the dead. I have sealed the cellar. May God forgive us for what we built." Suddenly, the thumping above stopped. The strobe light had finally burnt out. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Then, the sound of a heavy drill began to bite into the floorboards directly over their heads. Diana Vane was no longer looking for them in the tower. She had realized where the Real treasure was hidden. The drill is coming through the tool shed floor. Thomas hissed. We have to move to the exit. The cellar exit was a narrow stone staircase that led to a hidden cleft in the cliffside, several hundred yards away from the main road. They scrambled up the stairs, the air becoming fresher as they neared the surface. They emerged into the cold night air, hidden behind a thicket of gorse and salt-stunted trees. From this vantage point, they could see the entire point. The lighthouse was dark now, its great lamp ruined and smoking. But the ocean was a different story. The cargo ship, the vanishing point, was glowing with an ethereal, pulsing violet light. The shield was no longer just masking the ship. It was expanding. A ring of calm, shimmering water moved outward from the hull, and any bird that flew into the haze simply vanished, leaving no trace. Look. Elena pointed toward the tool shed. The syndicate had pulled the floorboards up completely. Diana Vane stood over the hole, her face illuminated by a handheld tablet. Beside her stood Julian Vane, the CEO. He wasn't tied up anymore. He was wearing a headset connected to one of the lead canisters they had pulled from the cellar. As Julian spoke into a microphone, the violet light on the ship miles away pulsed in perfect rhythm with his voice. "He's the transmitter." Thomas realized. He's not just influencing the crews, he's controlling the ship with his own neural patterns. The lead oscillator translates human brainwaves into the vanishing frequency. If he finishes the synchronization, Gable said, his voice trembling, the ship becomes a ghost that can strike any port in the world. It'll be a weapon that doesn't exist on any map. Thomas looked at the master fuse still tucked into his belt. He also looked at the Silas Vance logbook. He realized the vanishing point had a fatal flaw. Silas had mentioned the voices of the dead, the interference caused by human memories. Gable, the ledger. Thomas said, "It's not just names. It's a record of every person they've hurt to get this power. If we can broadcast the data from that ledger back into their frequency, it won't just jam the signal. It will feed the memories of the syndicate's crimes back into Julian's brain. It would kill him." Elena whispered. "It would stop the ship." Thomas countered. "And right now, that ship is the only thing that matters." They looked back at the lighthouse. To broadcast the ledger, they needed to reach the secondary radio antenna on the roof, the only piece of equipment Diana Vane hadn't dismantled. But to get there, they had to go back into the lion's den. The trek back to the lighthouse felt longer than the escape. The supernova strobe had burnt out, leaving the island in a thick, unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow the beam of Thomas's flashlight. The wind had shifted, now howling with a metallic edge, as if the very air was being distorted by the ship's expanding frequency. Thomas led the way, his hand gripping the cold iron of the stove bar, while Elena and Gable followed, shielded by the tall, salt-crusted gorse. They reached the base of the tower. The kitchen window was still a jagged maw of broken glass. Inside, the lighthouse was silent, but it wasn't empty. Thomas could hear the rhythmic clacking of a cooling engine. One of the syndicate's portable generators had been left running in the hall. They climbed through the window, their boots crunching softly on the glass shards. The secondary antenna is on the roof, above the lantern room. Gable whispered, his breath hitching. "But the signal processor is in the old wireless room on the 4th floor. We have to patch the ledger's data into the transmitter there before we can broadcast from the roof." They moved up the spiral stairs, staying close to the central pillar. As they passed the 2nd floor, Thomas saw a light flickering under the door of the living room. He signaled for silence. A shadow moved across the gap, a guard, likely left behind to monitor the lighthouse while Diana Vane worked at the tool shed. Thomas knew they couldn't risk a fight that would alert the others. He pulled a heavy brass weight from the grandfather clock in the hallway. With a sailor's precision, he rolled it down the stone stairs toward the 1st floor. The rhythmic thumping of the weight echoing in the hollow tower was loud enough to stir a ghost. The door to the living room flew open, and a guard stepped out, flashlight raised, following the sound down the stairs. "Now!" Thomas breathed. They slipped past the guard's position and raced up to the 4th floor. The wireless room was a cramped space filled with vacuum tubes and dusty manuals. In the center sat the secondary transmitter, a relic of the 1950s that looked primitive compared to the Vane's tech, but it was robust. "It's a different language," Thomas said, looking at the dials. "How do we feed the ledger into this?" Gable opened the black ledger. He didn't look at the names. He looked at the back cover, where he had hidden the microchip. "We don't use the chip yet. This transmitter uses punch tape or manual input. We have to translate the ledger's code into a frequency pulse. It's a manual override. If we can sync the transmitter's pulse to the ship's frequency, the ledger's data will ride the wave like a virus." Thomas looked at the transmitter's oscillation dial. The needle was vibrating. The ship's field was so strong it was already bleeding into the lighthouse's old wiring. They were running out of time. The transmitter hummed to life, a low, groaning sound that seemed to vibrate in Thomas's teeth. Arthur Gable's fingers flew across the manual frequency keys. His eyes locked on the ledger's code. He was translating names, dates, and account numbers into a series of staccato radio bursts. "I need a steady power source," Gable shouted over the growing electrical whine. "The generator downstairs isn't enough. Thomas, you have to go to the lantern room and bridge the main lamp's batteries to this circuit." Thomas nodded, but as he turned to the door, a heavy boot slammed against the wood. The guard he had tricked was back, and he wasn't alone. The door splintered inward. Thomas swung the metal stove bar, catching the first man in the shoulder, but the second guard had a stun baton. "Elena, the ledger!" Thomas yelled, pushing her toward the transmitter. He tackled the guard with the baton, the two of them crashing into a rack of old radio manuals. The air was filled with flying paper and the smell of ozone. Thomas felt a sharp jolt of electricity as the baton grazed his arm, his muscles locking up for a terrifying second. He gritted his teeth, the memory of Silas Vance and the empty grave giving him a surge of adrenaline. He grabbed the guard's wrist and slammed it against the sharp edge of the radio desk. Elena wasn't standing still. She grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it like a pendulum, hitting the other guard squarely in the chest. The man went down, gasping for air. "Get to the lantern room." "Thomas," Elena panted, her face set in a grim mask. "I'll help Arthur with the transmission." Thomas scrambled out of the room, his arm still tingling from the shock. He climbed the final flight of stairs to the lantern room. The air was thick with the scent of burnt copper from his earlier supernova stunt. He reached the battery array, massive lead-acid cells that stored the tower's emergency power. He saw the cables. They were thick, encrusted with years of salt and corrosion. He needed to bridge them to the wireless room's feed. He used his sailor's knife to strip the heavy insulation, the sparks flying as the metal touched. Suddenly, a voice echoed from the rooftop hatch above him. "You're a persistent nuisance, Mr. Wicks." Thomas looked up. Diana Vane was standing on the ladder, her hair whipping in the wind. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding a remote detonator. "My brother is already synchronized," she said, her voice eerily calm. "The ship is the new reality. This lighthouse is just an anchor to a world that's ending. If you bridge those batteries, you'll trigger the thermite charges I've placed on the central pillar. You'll save the transmission, but you'll bring the tower down on your heads." Thomas looked at the sparking cables in his hand, then up at Diana Vane. The logic was simple. Save the lighthouse and let the world fall to the Syndicate, or destroy the lighthouse and take the Syndicate's signal with it. A lighthouse isn't just stone and glass. "Ms. Vane," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "It's a promise. And I don't plan on breaking mine." He didn't bridge the cables to the main circuit. Instead, he lunged for the rooftop hatch, throwing his weight against the ladder. Diana Vane, surprised by his speed, tried to kick out, but Thomas grabbed her boot and pulled. She slid down the ladder, the detonator clattering across the metal floor. Thomas didn't wait to see if she recovered. He scrambled through the hatch and onto the roof. The wind was a physical wall, pushing him toward the edge. The vanishing point ship was now a glowing purple sun on the horizon, the violet haze reaching almost to the shore. In the center of the roof stood the secondary antenna, a tall, skeletal structure of aluminum and wire. The cables from the wireless room were already humming, but they weren't connected to the main mast. They were vibrating in the air, the vanishing frequency preventing the radio waves from leaving the tower. Thomas reached the base of the antenna. He could see the violet light reflecting off the clouds. He pulled the master fuse from his belt, the one he had taken from the sub-basement. He realized it wasn't just a fuse, it was a tuning fork. He jammed the fuse into the antenna's grounding port. The effect was like a lightning strike. A bolt of blue energy surged from the wireless room below, traveling up the wires and through the antenna. Thomas was thrown back, his back hitting the railing. The antenna didn't just broadcast, it glowed. A beam of concentrated data, the names of the victims, the crimes of the syndicate, shot out from the lighthouse, piercing the violet haze of the ship. Below him, he heard a scream. Not from the lighthouse, but from the frequency itself. The broadcast had reached the ship, and more importantly, it had reached Julian Vane's mind. The voices of the dead that Silas Vance had warned about were no longer a metaphor. They were a torrent of data, a million digital memories crashing into a single human brain. Thomas looked out at the sea. The violet haze was flickering. The ship was no longer a ghost. It was a target. And on the horizon, the Coast Guard cutters were finally seeing the truth. As the blue energy surged from the secondary antenna, the violet haze surrounding the vanishing point didn't just flicker, it tore. Thomas watched from the roof as the shimmering dome of the dead zone shattered like glass under a sonic boom. The names, dates, and crimes contained within the black ledger were no longer just ink on paper. They were a digital tsunami of guilt, flooding the neural link Julian Vane had established with the ship's lead oscillator. Below the lighthouse, near the tool shed, Julian Vane let out a sound that wasn't human. It was a high-pitched electronic shriek that echoed through the headsets of every syndicate guard on the island. The voices of the dead Silas Vance had written about in his 1924 logbook were now a torrent of raw, unfiltered memory. For Julian, it was as if 1,000 lives were being lived and lost inside his mind in a single second. The violet light on the cargo ship turned a sickly, bruised grey. The silver domes, the satellite dishes, began to spin wildly, out of sync. The calm, shimmering ring of water was replaced by the natural, violent chop of the Atlantic. The ghost ship was suddenly just a massive target sitting low in the water. On the horizon, the Coast Guard cutter Aegis and its sister ships didn't hesitate. With the jamming field gone, their radar screens lit up with a massive contact. Thomas felt the vibration in the roof beneath his boots change. The deep, rhythmic hum of the syndicate's signal was being replaced by a frantic, erratic pulse. He turned back to the hatch just as Diana Vane climbed out, her face contorted in a mask of agony. She had her hands pressed to her ears, her own headset smoking. "Stop it!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "The feedback, you're killing him. The feedback is the truth." "Diana," Thomas yelled back, fighting the wind. "Your brother didn't just want to control ships. He wanted to own the people on them. Now he has to live with everything the syndicate did to make that happen." Diana lunged for the remote detonator she had dropped near the hatch. Thomas moved to intercept her, but the roof was slick with sea spray. He slipped, his hand catching the railing just as Diana's fingers closed around the plastic trigger. She didn't look at him, she looked out at the sea, where her brother's legacy was dissolving into the waves. "If the ship falls," she whispered, "this island goes with it." The click of the detonator was small, but the sound that followed was catastrophic. Deep within the central pillar of the lighthouse, the thermite charges Diana had planted ignited. A brilliant, white-hot glow began to seep through the cracks in the stone. Thermite doesn't explode like dynamite. It burns at a temperature high enough to melt steel and turn rock into lava. Thomas felt the heat rising through the soles of his boots. The structural integrity of the Stormy Point Lighthouse, a tower that had survived a century of hurricanes, was being eaten from the inside out. Gable. Elena. Get out, Thomas roared down the hatch. He didn't wait for Diana. He knew the tower was a chimney now, and the heat would rise faster than the fire. He scrambled down the ladder into the lantern room. The air was already thick with the smell of vaporized mercury and burning stone. He found Arthur, Gable and Elena at the base of the wireless room stairs, struggling with a jammed door while the two syndicate guards lay unconscious on the floor. "The central pillar is melting," Thomas shouted, grabbing the door handle. "We have to use the outside gallery." The spiral staircase was located directly around the central pillar. It was becoming a vertical furnace. The exterior maintenance gallery, the narrow ledge used for cleaning the windows, was their only hope, though it was 80 feet above the jagged rocks. Thomas used the stove bar to wedge the wireless room door open, hauling Gable and Elena through. They burst onto the outer gallery. The wind was fierce, but the air was cold, a mercy compared to the inferno growing inside. Below them, the syndicate's trucks were already peeling away from the tool shed, the guards abandoning their posts as the lighthouse began to glow like a giant, dying coal. "The ledger," Gable gasped, clutching the iron box to his chest. "We can't let it burn. We have to worry about our lives first." "Arthur," Elena cried, looking down at the narrow iron ladder that led to the lower levels. They began the descent, the metal of the ladder already warm to the touch. Every few seconds, a piece of the lighthouse's outer casing would crack and fall, plunging into the darkness below. As they reached the second floor, Thomas looked toward the tool shed. He saw Julian Vane collapse in the mud, his headset sparking. Diana was there now, trying to drag him toward the last remaining truck. But they weren't the only ones moving. From the shadows of the sea caves, a new group of figures emerged. They weren't syndicate, and they weren't Coast Guard. They were the villagers, led by Elena's brother, Peter. They were armed with gaffs and old hunting rifles, their faces illuminated by the burning tower. The people of Stormy Point were taking their island back. While the lighthouse burned, the battle for the Atlantic was reaching its climax. With the vanishing field completely collapsed, the Coast Guard cutter Aegis didn't waste a second. Thomas watched from the safety of the cliffside as the massive ship surged forward, its 25mm chain gun firing warning shots across the bow of the vanishing point. "They're boarding," Thomas whispered, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Through his binoculars, he saw the specialized boarding teams, tactical law enforcement, deploying from the Aegis in high-speed interceptors. They hit the side of the cargo ship like a swarm of blue hornets. The syndicate's crew, deprived of their electronic shield and their leader's neural guidance, was in total disarray. "Bridge is secure. We have multiple lead oscillator units on deck. Requesting hazmat and technical experts immediately." Intercepted radio transmission from the Aegis. On the island, the situation was equally grim for the syndicate. Peter and the villagers had surrounded the Vane's truck. Diana stood her ground, her pistol raised, but she was outnumbered and surrounded by men and women who had lost friends and family to the syndicate's disappearances. "Put it down, Diana," Peter shouted, his voice steady. "There's nowhere left to run. The ship is taken, and your vanishing point is just a coordinate for a prison cell." Thomas, Gable, and Elena reached the edge of the cliff, panting and covered in soot. They watched as the lighthouse, the beacon that had guided Thomas to this mystery, suffered its final indignity. The top of the tower, weakened by the melting central pillar, tilted slowly toward the sea. With a sound like 1,000 windows breaking at once, the lantern room and the great Fresnel lens slid off the masonry and plummeted into the ocean. The light was gone. "It's over," Gable said softly, his eyes wet with tears. He looked at the smoking stump of the tower. Silas Vance's curse is finally finished. Is it? Thomas asked, looking at the black ledger. The ship is taken, the Vanes are caught. But the Syndicate, a group that can build a machine like that, isn't just one ship and one lighthouse. We've won the Battle of Stormy Point. Arthur. But I think we've just signed up for a much longer war. As if to answer him, the microchip inside the ledger's cover began to pulse with a faint, steady green light. A signal that wasn't being sent to the ship, but to someone much further away. The smoke from the collapsed lantern room rose in a dark, thick column against the morning sky. Thomas, Elena, and Arthur Gable stood at the cliff's edge, watching the villagers surround the Vanes. The victory felt heavy. The lighthouse, which had been Thomas's sanctuary and his mystery, was now a jagged ruin. But it was the small, rhythmic green glow from the black ledger that commanded Thomas's attention. "That's not a local signal," Gable said, his voice trembling as he stared at the pulsing microchip embedded in the leather cover. The lead oscillator in the ship was the broadcast. This is a beacon. It's an extraction signal." Thomas looked out toward the horizon. The Coast Guard cutters were busy towing the vanishing point, their attention focused on the captured ship. But further out, where the mist still clung to the water, a new shape was emerging. It wasn't a cargo ship or a cutter. It was a sleek, black hydrofoil, moving with a speed that defied the rough Atlantic swells. It carried no markings, no flag, and no lights. "They're coming for the ledger," Thomas realized. The Vanes were just the front line. The Syndicate is sending a cleanup crew. On the ground, Diana Vane saw the black craft and laughed, a cold, desperate sound. Even with Peter's rifle pointed at her, she stood tall. "You think you've won because the light is out. That ship is the Eraser. It doesn't capture, it removes. In 10 minutes, there won't be a witness left on this island, and the ledger will be back where it belongs." Peter looked at Thomas, then at the approaching hydrofoil. "We can't fight that with hunting rifles. Thomas, we need to get the ledger off this point." "No," Thomas said, his eyes narrowing. "If we run, they'll just hunt us down one by one. The signal is coming from the chip. If we want them to stop, we have to change the signal." Thomas grabbed the ledger from Gable. He remembered the etched lines on the master fuse he still carried. The fuse was a tuning fork, designed to resonate with the Syndicate's technology. He looked at the smoking remains of the lighthouse. The central pillar was still glowing with thermite heat, creating a powerful electromagnetic field. "Arthur, if we can get the chip close to the thermal core of the pillar, the heat and the magnetism will scramble the beacon. We can turn this extraction signal into a distress call that will draw every federal ship for 100 miles. It's a suicide mission." "Thomas," Elena cried. "The tower could collapse completely at any second." "Then we'd better be fast," Thomas replied, already turning back toward the ruins. The heat radiating from the base of the lighthouse was staggering. The stone walls, once cool and damp, were now dry and cracking, hissing as the morning dew evaporated instantly. Thomas stepped through the scorched kitchen. The floorboards curled like burnt paper. He could hear the groan of the masonry above, the sound of a giant about to fall. He reached the central pillar. The thermite had burned through the lead shielding of the sub-basement, creating a molten river of metal that pooled at the base. The air was a shimmering haze of heat. Thomas pulled the microchip from the ledger, the tiny green light blinking faster now, almost frantic. "Come on," he hissed, his skin blistering. He held the chip near the glowing pillar. He didn't drop it into the fire. Not yet. He needed to use the pillar's residual magnetism to overclock the chip's frequency. He pulled the master fuse from his belt and held it parallel to the chip. A high-pitched whine, like 1,000 angry wasps, filled the room. The green light on the chip turned a violent, electric blue. Outside, the black hydrofoil slowed down, its sensors likely confused by the sudden surge in signal strength. Suddenly, a shadow blocked the kitchen door. It was Julian Vane. He had escaped the villagers' grasp in the confusion, his face a roadmap of burst capillaries from the neural feedback, his eyes vacant but driven by a singular, programmed instinct. He wasn't the CEO anymore. He was a broken machine trying to return to its power source. "Give it to me," Julian rasped, his hands reaching out, charred and shaking. "It's over." "Julian," Thomas said, backing toward the molten pool. "The frequency is dead. You're just hearing the echoes now." Julian lunged. He wasn't fast, but he was heavy and desperate. Thomas dodged to the side, but the floor gave way under the heat. He slipped, the microchip flying from his hand and landing on a ledge of glowing stone, just inches from the thermite core. The beacon began to scream, a literal, audible sound that vibrated through the air. On the horizon, the black hydrofoil turned sharply. It wasn't coming to extract anymore. The signal Thomas had created was a critical failure code. The hydrofoil's weapon systems, a series of high-energy lasers, began to track the lighthouse. They were going to erase the source of the noise. Thomas scrambled to his feet as the first beam from the hydrofoil struck the top of the cliff. It wasn't an explosion. It was a silent, terrifying burst of heat that turned a ton of granite into steam. The syndicate's cleanup crew was being thorough. They were leveling the point to ensure the distress signal stopped. "Thomas! Get out of there!" Gable's voice echoed from outside. Thomas looked at Julian Vane. The man had crawled toward the microchip, his fingers closing around the blue-glowing silicon. In that moment, the neural link Julian had established with the syndicate's network reconnected for one final, devastating second. Julian's eyes cleared. He looked at the chip, then at Thomas. They don't leave witnesses," Julian whispered, a flash of his former self returning. "Not even their architects." Julian didn't try to run. He pressed the chip against the white-hot thermite core of the pillar. The resulting surge of energy acted like a lightning rod. The hydrofoil sensors locked onto the massive energy spike. Thomas realized what was happening. Julian was anchoring the target to himself. "Run, sailor!" Julian shouted. Thomas dove through the broken kitchen window just as the second beam from the eraser struck the lighthouse. This time, it hit the base. The stone tower didn't just fall. It vanished in a cloud of white light and pulverized rock. The shockwave threw Thomas 50 feet across the grass, his world turning into a blur of gray dust and silence. When he opened his eyes, the lighthouse was gone. Only a smoking hole in the ground remained. The black hydrofoil, its mission seemingly complete, began to turn back toward the deep ocean. But it had stayed a moment too long. The Coast Guard cutter Aegis, alerted by the massive energy signatures and the distress pulse, had closed the distance. "Vessel in the mist, this is the United States Coast Guard." The radio on Thomas's belt crackled. "Heave to and prepare to be boarded, or we will open fire." The hydrofoil ignored the command, its engines roaring as it tried to accelerate. But the Aegis was ready. A single, well-placed shot from the cutter's deck gun struck the hydrofoil stern. The sleek black craft didn't sink. Its experimental fuel cells detonated, creating a blue fireball that lit up the entire coast. Thomas sat up, coughing and covered in grit. Elena and Gable ran toward him, tears streaming down their faces. "It's gone," Gable whispered, looking at the empty space where the tower had stood for over a century. "Everything is gone." "No," Thomas said, reaching into his soaked jacket. He pulled out a small, charred, but intact piece of paper. It was the last page of Silas Vance's logbook, the one he had tucked away before the fire. "The tower is gone, but we still have the truth. And now, the world knows where the syndicate is hiding." The dust of the lighthouse's destruction hung in the air like a grey shroud. As the sun began to climb over the Atlantic, the scene at Stormy Point was one of absolute devastation. Where the proud white tower had stood for generations, there was now only a jagged, smoking crater. The villagers stood in small groups, their faces smudged with ash, watching as the Coast Guard's heavy transport helicopters began to descend onto the cliffside like giant, noisy birds of prey. Thomas sat on a large rock, his hands still shaking. Elena sat beside him, wrapping a heavy wool blanket around his shoulders. "The federal investigators are coming," she said quietly. "Peter is down at the dock. They're taking Diana Vane into custody." She hasn't said a word since the tower fell. Thomas didn't respond. He was looking at the last page of Silas Vance's logbook. The paper was fragile, almost turning to dust in the wind. The writing was a frantic scrawl, dated minutes before the 1924 fire. "The frequency is not a tool. It is a door. They think they are sending signals, but they are inviting something in. The sea caves are not empty. They never were. I will burn the light to seal the gate." "Arthur," Thomas called out. Gable moved toward him, his face aged by 20 years in a single night. What did Silas mean by the gate? He didn't just burn the lighthouse because of the syndicate's ancestors. He was afraid of something else. Gable looked down into the smoking ruins. "There's a legend on this island, Thomas. Older than the lighthouse. They call it the deep pulse. It's a low-frequency vibration that comes from the trench 10 miles out. The syndicate didn't invent the vanishing frequency. They just found a way to copy it. But Silas realized that when you copy the pulse, the original, it answers." Thomas looked out at the water where the vanishing point was being towed. The gray, bruised color of the sea hadn't changed back to blue. The water around the ship was still unnaturally calm, even as the storm-driven waves crashed elsewhere. "The ship," Thomas whispered. "The lead oscillators are still on that ship. They're still broadcasting, even if the signal is weak." Suddenly, the ground beneath them shivered. It wasn't an earthquake, and it wasn't the helicopters. It was a deep, guttural vibration that seemed to come from miles below the seabed. The vibration grew stronger, turning the pebbles on the ground into a frantic, dancing swarm. On the horizon, the Coast Guard cutters suddenly came to a halt. The tow lines connected to the vanishing point snapped with a sound like whip cracks. "What's happening?" Elena cried, grabbing Thomas's arm. Thomas picked up his binoculars. The cargo ship wasn't sinking. Instead, the water beneath it was beginning to boil, not with heat, but with displacement. A massive, dark shape was rising from the depths. A shadow so large it made the cargo ship look like a toy. "The deep pulse," Gable whispered, his voice full of a primal terror. The signal didn't just attract the syndicate's hydrofoil. It woke the source. A massive, bioluminescent hum filled the air. It was a sound that didn't hit the ears. It hit the heart. It was the same frequency as the voices of the dead, but magnified 1,000 times. From the dark water, a series of ancient, metallic structures emerged, obsidian-black spires covered in age-old barnacles and glowing with a faint, pulsing blue light. They weren't natural. They were machines, older than humanity, hidden in the Atlantic Trench for eons. The Syndicate didn't build the vanishing point technology, Thomas realized, his mind racing through the entries in the ledger. They found one of those spires decades ago. They've been trying to reverse engineer a god. The spires surrounded the vanishing point. The cargo ship, with all its lead oscillators and Syndicate secrets, was being pulled downward. The Coast Guard ships tried to move away, their engines roaring, but they were caught in a massive, swirling vortex. "We have to help them," Elena shouted. "There's nothing we can do," Gable said, pulling her back from the cliff edge. "The frequency is resetting. It's a self-correcting system. The gate Silas wrote about, it's closing, and it's taking the Syndicate's mistakes with it." As the vanishing point was dragged into the abyss, a final, blinding flash of blue light erupted from the water. The pressure wave hit the cliff like a physical blow, knocking everyone to the ground. When Thomas looked up, the sea was flat, dark, and silent. The spires were gone. The cargo ship was gone. Only the Coast Guard cutters remained, bobbing helplessly in the sudden calm. The federal agents who swarmed Stormy Point an hour later were not the friendly sort. They wore black suits and spoke in acronyms, sequestering the villagers and confiscating every piece of equipment they could find. They didn't want to hear about ancient spires or the deep pulse. They wanted the black ledger. But the ledger was gone. It had fallen into the molten thermite core with Julian Vane. Thomas sat in the back of a government van, being questioned by a man with a cold, grey stare. "Let's go over it one more time, Mr. Wicks," the agent said. "The ship simply disappeared." "I told you," Thomas said, his voice weary. "The machinery on board malfunctioned. There was a structural failure in the seabed. The ship was lost." He didn't tell them about the spires. He didn't tell them about Silas Vance's warning. He knew that if the government, or another syndicate, found out what was truly at the bottom of the trench, the war would never end. Some secrets were meant to stay in the dark. By evening, the agents had cleared out, leaving a small guard at the ruin. Thomas, Elena, and Gable stood together on the dock. Peter's boat was repaired, and the village was quiet. The mystery of Stormy Point had been scrubbed from the official record, labeled as a terrorist incident involving industrial espionage. "What will you do now, Thomas?" Elena asked. Thomas looked at the horizon. The spot where the lighthouse had stood was empty, but in his mind, he could still see the light sweeping across the waves. He reached into his pocket and felt the charred scrap of paper from the logbook. "I think I've had enough of lighthouses," Thomas said with a small, tired smile. But Silas Vance left one more note on the back of this page. "It's a set of coordinates. Not here. Further north, in the Arctic Circle." He called it the second beacon. Gable looked at him, a spark of the old keeper's curiosity returning to his eyes. The syndicate had more than one site, and they won't stop until someone shuts them all down, Thomas said. He looked at Elena, then at the sea. "The light is out at Stormy Point, but there are other shadows that need a keeper." Elena gripped his hand. "Then we'd better start moving. The tide is turning." The boat moved steadily through the dark, icy waters of the North Atlantic. Behind them, the rugged cliffs of Stormy Point had faded into a jagged line on the horizon, the empty space where the lighthouse once stood a silent testament to the secrets they had unearthed. Thomas stood at the bow of Peter's fishing vessel, the Elena May, feeling the sting of the freezing spray against his face. It was a different kind of cold than the damp chill of the island. This was the dry, biting air of the high latitudes. In his pocket, the charred scrap of Silas Vance's logbook felt like a heavy weight. The coordinates written on the back: 71 degrees 10 minutes 21 seconds north, 25 degrees 47 minutes 40 seconds east, pointed toward a desolate stretch of the Norwegian coast, far above the Arctic Circle. According to Silas, it was the location of a second beacon, a twin to Stormy Point that had remained hidden since the 1920s. The final inventory. As the sun set, casting long, purple shadows over the waves, Thomas met Arthur Gable and Elena in the small cabin. On the table between them lay the few artifacts they had managed to save from the fire. The master fuse, now cold and inert, but still bearing the strange, microscopic etchings. The logbook scrap, the final warning of a man who had seen the gate. The brass weight, taken from the lighthouse clock, a simple reminder of the time that had run out for Stormy Point. "The syndicate thinks we died in the collapse," Gable said, cleaning his spectacles with a trembling hand. "The official report says there were no survivors from the central pillar area. For now, we are ghosts. That's our only advantage," Thomas replied. He looked at the map. "If there's another vanishing point in the Arctic, they'll be moving to activate it now that Stormy Point is gone. Julian Vane was just one architect. The syndicate has others." Elena looked at Thomas, her expression a mix of sorrow and determination. You don't have to do this, Thomas. You could go back to the mainland. You could find a quiet life. Thomas looked out the porthole at the North Star, the ancient navigator's guide. A quiet life is a luxury the truth doesn't allow. Elena. I spent years on the deck of a ship looking for a home. I found it in a lighthouse, and I watched it burn to save the world from a shadow. I'm a keeper now. Whether there's a tower or not, I'm keeping the light. The infinite horizon. As the Elena May surged northward, the sky began to shimmer with the first faint traces of the aurora borealis, vibrant ribbons of green and violet that danced across the stars. To anyone else, it was a natural wonder. But to Thomas, the rhythmic pulsing of the light looked hauntingly familiar. It looked like a frequency. He realized then that the war against the Syndicate and the Deep Pulse wasn't something that could be won with a single explosion or a stolen ledger. It was a constant watch, a perpetual shift at the edge of the world. The tide is rising. Thomas whispered to the empty sea. He took the master fuse and dropped it into the deep, black water. He didn't need the Syndicate's technology to find them. He had the coordinates, he had his companions, and he had the hard-earned wisdom of a man who had looked into the abyss and didn't blink. The mystery of Stormy Point had ended, but the story of the Keeper had only just begun. Somewhere in the frozen north, a second light was waiting to be found, or extinguished, and Thomas Wicks was already on his way.